In the hush of night, when the stars whisper secrets to the earth, there are names that rise like echoes from the dust of forgotten thrones. They wore crowns not just of gold, but of destiny, ruling empires with fire in their eyes and silence in their hearts. From shadowed deserts to frostbitten kingdoms, their footsteps shaped the world, not always with mercy, but always with might. Tonight, let us journey through time, where power slept beside prophecy, and history was written beneath the weight of a crown. This is the story of the greatest kings in history. Chapter 1: The Boy in the Mountain Shadows. The night was heavy with silence, as if the stars themselves dared not whisper. In the high palace of Ecbatana, a king tossed in troubled sleep. Astyages, the last great king of the Median line, stirred beneath embroidered sheets of gold, while a storm moved silently behind his closed eyes. He was a man who ruled with iron certainty, who silenced threats before they could form. Yet this night, a vision unraveled him. In his dream, he saw his daughter, Mandane, cradling a child. From that child's body, vines began to grow, slowly at first, then with urgent hunger. They wrapped around pillars and stairways, burst through stone, and climbed high into the heavens. His palace cracked beneath their weight, his throne shattered, and from the ruin rose a foreign name, Cyrus. The king woke breathless, sweat clinging to his skin despite the cool desert wind outside. He called his magi, the keepers of secret knowledge, and begged them to interpret the omen. Their faces tightened as they listened. It was clear. The child his daughter would bear would destroy him, would end his rule, and rise as something far greater. The very blood that ran through Mandane carried the seed of another empire. Astyages did what many kings do when fear claws at reason. He chose control over trust. He summoned Mandane, already wed to Cambyses, a nobleman from the quiet land of Anshan in southern Persia. When her child was born, he did not come to hold him. Instead, he sent a servant, Harpagus, with orders masked in sorrow. The child, his grandson, was to be killed. Silently, swiftly, forgotten. But Harpagus, though loyal, had a heart that could not bear such cruelty. In the stillness of the morning, he took the infant away, his hands trembling with the weight of fate. And instead of a blade, he delivered the child to a shepherd, a humble man named Mithridates, who lived among the quiet hills near the Zagros Mountains. The boy was to be raised not as a prince, but as a shadow, not as an heir, but as a secret. And so began the legend, not with a sword or crown, but with a dream, a warning, and a whisper hidden in the folds of mountain silence. A child among shepherds, in the cradle of the mountains, far from the marble halls of Ecbatana, the boy who would be king learned the rhythms of the earth. His name was never spoken in noble tongues, only called out across goat pastures and beside cold rivers. Kurus, though the shepherds knew not what that name would someday mean. The wind taught him patience, the sky endurance, the mountain taught him silence, and from silence came strength. He did not wear silk, but wool. His meals were not feasts but crusts and roots, shared with animals and neighbors. He knew the sting of snow and the crack of dry heat. But above all, he knew the quiet dignity of those who endure, the shepherds who stitched their lives into the earth without complaint. Mithridates and his wife, though not of royal blood, wove love into the boy's life. They raised him not as a prince, but as their own. And perhaps that is what made the difference. From early on, the boy stood out. His posture, his speech, even his eyes, they did not carry the weight of common things. He spoke with clarity beyond his years. Other boys followed him instinctively. When disputes rose among children or men, he calmed them. When danger came from wolves or storms, he stood first, not last. By the time he was 10, even the village elders watched him as if some ancient soul had returned in his form. But fate has a way of revealing itself no matter how deeply buried. One spring, a festival was held. Children played games of imitation, pretending to be kings and soldiers. Cyrus, bold and radiant, was chosen to play king. He issued playful commands and the others followed, even sons of nobles who happened to pass through the valley that day. One such boy, struck during the game, returned home in anger and told his real father, a nobleman who served King Astyages. The story, strange as it was, reached the ears of the king himself. A peasant boy who held such command, who bore the face of something eerily familiar. Astyages demanded the boy be brought to court. When Cyrus stood before the king, the truth unraveled like a tapestry. His face, his voice, his very presence stirred something old in the aging monarch. The shepherd was questioned, then Harpagus, and at last, the veil lifted. The king realized what had been done. His order had been disobeyed, and the boy had lived. Astyages, now softened by guilt and age, did not kill him. Perhaps he feared the prophecy even more than he feared rebellion. Instead, he allowed the boy to live, sending him back to his true parents in Anshan, a quiet return to the bloodline from which he came. But something had changed in the mountains. The boy had not grown in courts. He had grown in the wild, shaped not by palace walls but by the hard, honest hands of shepherds. Cyrus was no longer just a prince. He was the mountain's child, and the world would remember him that way. Returned to royal blood. When Cyrus returned to Anshan, he did not wear the pride of a prince. He wore the calm of a man who knew who he was. His mother, Mandane, wept as she embraced him, feeling the breath of divine promise in his shoulders. His father, Cambyses, offered him a quiet nod, a nobleman of few words, but much strength. The court of Anshan, once silent and half-forgotten in the shadow of Median rule, began to stir. Word spread quickly. The child who had been lost had returned. Persia was not yet an empire. It was a name held in whispers, a place between deserts and mountains, a people with no great claim. But Cyrus saw not what it was, but what it could be. He saw not walls, but roads, not tribes, but unity. In the silence of night, he walked alone through Anshan's streets, listening to the pulse of his people. Farmers, traders, elders, all spoke of tiredness under Median rule. Their land was taxed, their sons conscripted, their voice muted. Cyrus did not rise in rage. He rose in resolve. He gathered men not by gold, but by promise. He did not shout his name, he listened to theirs. He met with tribal leaders, not with arrogance, but with respect. He rode into distant villages alone, knowing their fears and speaking with their elders. He sowed trust where others sowed fear. In time, the strength of Anshan began to hum with something ancient, something that felt like awakening. And beneath it all was Cyrus, calm and patient, not acting from vengeance, but from vision. He knew his destiny was not to reclaim what was taken, but to build what had never been. The Medes, strong but fractured, watched this movement with disdain. They saw a boy in royal robes and thought him naive. But Cyrus was not simply returning to blood. He was answering a calling far older than lineage. The people followed him because they saw in him not just a leader, but a mirror of their own quiet hopes. The boy once hidden in the mountains was no longer hidden. His name was spoken across deserts and into cities. And with every whisper, the old prophecy stirred. The tree would grow, the palace would crack, and the crown would fall not to destroy but to remake the world. The first conquest, it began not with swords, but with footsteps, with men who walked behind Cyrus not because they had to, but because they chose to. His first move was bold, a revolt against the Medes. But it was not revolt in the usual sense. It was not drenched in rage or vengeance. It moved like a storm behind the hills, silent, inevitable. Harpagus, the man who once spared his life, now joined his cause from within the Median court. Others followed not from fear, but from belief. The Medes, ruled by an aging Astyages who no longer heard the heartbeats of his people, were slow to see it coming. When battle came, it came like a tide. Persian farmers fought beside horsemen. Archers stood beside shepherds. They carried no grand symbols, only the dream of a nation their children might one day name with pride. The Battle of Pasargadae, though history blurs the name, became the song of Persia's birth. And when Astyages fell, it was not with cries, but with silence. Cyrus did not humiliate him. He welcomed him with respect, for he knew the old king had given him life twice, once through blood, once through mercy. And from that moment the world changed. Persia was no longer a whisper, it was a voice, an empire born not from conquest, but from vision. From the mountains a boy had walked into legend, and in his hands he carried not just a sword, but a new way of rule. Cyrus would go on to build the first great empire of humanity, one where many nations, tongues, and faiths lived under a single banner, not in chains, but in peace. But in this first chapter of his life, the lesson was already clear. Greatness is not forged in gold, nor born of palaces. It is shaped in silence. It is carved in exile, and it begins always with a dream of something gentler, something grander, something just beyond the mountains. Chapter 2. The Storm Behind the Eyes. Before he could hold a sword, he held a book. Before he was feared by kings, he sat quietly under olive trees, listening to a man who spoke of stars and reason. Alexander, son of Philip of Macedon, was born into a world that sharpened him like a blade. His father was iron, not just in will but in ambition, stretching Macedon from a rugged northern state to a power that shook Greece itself. But even iron needs fire, and Alexander's fire came not only from battlefields but from thought. From a young age, the boy was wrapped in contradiction, brutality and brilliance, affection and strategy. Philip taught him how to command armies with his eyes and silence a room with a gesture. But it was Aristotle, the philosopher of the world, who shaped the inner storm of the boy's mind. Under the wide skies of Mysa, surrounded by other sons of Macedonian nobility, Alexander was not just taught geography, poetry, and medicine. He was taught why the stars moved, why men wage war, and why death, in the end, cannot be avoided. He read Homer as if it were his own story, especially the wrath of Achilles, a hero bound by glory and doomed by pride. The stories did not just inspire him, they haunted him. He wanted to be remembered, not just obeyed. He believed the soul of a man could stretch across centuries if it was loud enough, bold enough, bright enough. He studied the anatomy of greatness, and then, with the quiet intensity of a storm waiting to break, he began to build it. The boy trained not only his mind but his body, racing horses, hunting lions, learning to fight as well as he could speak. He tamed Bucephalus, a horse so wild no man could ride it, not with violence but with insight. He saw that the beast feared its own shadow and turned it toward the sun. In that moment, the court saw more than a prince. They saw a storm with golden hair and burning eyes. And then, the moment that would change the course of history, Philip fell, assassinated, struck down in the height of his power. And Alexander, just 20 years old, inherited not only a kingdom, but a legacy made of iron, fire, and unfinished dreams. A crown at 20. Grief does not wait for youth to catch up. In the wake of Philip's death, Macedonia trembled, and so did the fragile order of the Greek world. But Alexander, barely more than a boy, stepped forward with the stillness of a man twice his age and the fury of a king born too early. There was no time to mourn. He silenced rebellion not with speeches but with action. Thebes dared to rise, and he reduced it to ruins, its name etched in ash. The other Greek cities watched, breath held, as Alexander reminded the world that his crown did not sit loosely on his head. But this was not a king content with borders. The world he inherited was not enough. His dreams reached farther than maps dared draw. His soul burned for conquest, not just of lands, but of immortality. The campaign that began was not one of mere expansion. It was a march into myth. With a voice that stirred hearts and a presence that cracked stone, Alexander rallied his armies and set his gaze eastward, toward Persia, toward Darius, toward glory. But within him stirred something quieter, an ache, perhaps, inherited from the hollow left by his father's death, an unease that even as he conquered, something was slipping from him. He pushed forward not just to win, but to escape what followed. He wore the crown not as comfort, but as burden, one that whispered always, "You are not yet enough," the empire of lightning. When Alexander crossed the Hellespont, The sea trembled beneath him. This was no ordinary invasion, it was a lightning bolt cast across the earth. The battles came swiftly, each like a drumbeat echoing through history. At Granicus, he fought at the river's edge, leading from the front, striking like fire incarnate. At Issus, the Persian army outnumbered his, but not in will. There, Darius fled, his family captured, and Alexander began to taste divinity. The son of Philip now stood where the kings of old once stood, and the East, ancient, proud, and vast, felt the tremor of his footsteps. Then came Gaugamela, the great field of decision, a flat plain turned sacred by the clash of destiny. The numbers told one story. Persia had hundreds of thousands, Alexander had far fewer. But he had something else, movement like lightning, strategy like poetry, and the eyes of a commander who knew the rhythm of death and victory. He broke the Persian lines with the silence of a predator and the scream of thunder. Darius vanished once more, and with him the last breath of the old empire. Babylon opened its gates. Persepolis, the jeweled capital, burned under starlight, not by accident, but by command. Alexander set it aflame, a symbolic ending. The East was conquered. The gods, it seemed, had made a man of storm. And yet, what does lightning do once it strikes? It fades. It vanishes. It leaves behind silence and smoke. So too did Alexander press on, deeper into lands no Greek had seen. Not for need, not for riches, but because to stop would be to feel the quiet. And he feared that quiet more than he feared death. The march that broke the world. Beyond the mountains of Persia, beyond the rivers of Bactria, Alexander walked into legend. He crossed the Hindu Kush in winter, a path of snow and breathless air. He married Roxana, the daughter of a nobleman from Sogdiana, perhaps for love, perhaps for politics, perhaps to touch something soft in a world turning sharp. But the men began to whisper. Their boots wore thin. Their hearts grew heavy. They had marched too far, seen too much. The lands turned stranger. The language of trees and wind no longer sounded familiar. And yet Alexander kept going. India loomed ahead, vast, lush, unknowable. At the Hydaspes River, he met King Porus. It was a battle of equals, finally. Elephants trampled the earth. Rain soaked their armor, and the Macedonian phalanx strained under the weight of exhaustion. But Alexander, who had crossed deserts, mountains, and doubt, broke through once more. Porus, though defeated, stood tall. And Alexander, recognizing a king in him, made him an ally rather than a prisoner. But even lightning cannot burn forever. His men, their eyes hollow with the weight of distance, refused to go farther. They missed home. They missed rest. They missed being men, not shadows following a dream too large. And for the first time, Alexander did not rage. He listened. They turned back, carving a hard path through the Gedrosian desert. Heat swallowed them, sand drank their water, and many died. Not from battle, but from silence and thirst. The storm began to lose its shape. In Babylon, Alexander stood again, wearing robes of the East, speaking the languages of many lands, dreaming of uniting worlds. But something had shifted. Friends had fallen. He was now surrounded by suspicion, isolation, and an empire too large to carry. At 32, the king who had never lost a battle lost something else, his strength. Fever took him. Some said poison. Some said heartbreak. But perhaps it was the weight of being more than mortal. Perhaps the storm inside him had finally run out of sky. He died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. No air, no peace, only legend. His body, carried in gold and guarded by silence, would sleep not in Macedonia, but in Alexandria, the city he had named for himself as he had named dozens more. But names fade. What remains is the storm behind his eyes, that haunting longing to be remembered, that ache for something beyond the crown, that restless hunger for a world that would never be enough. And in the quiet of night, when the stars look down on old ruins and broken maps, perhaps Alexander still walks, not toward victory, but toward understanding. Not to conquer, but to rest. Chapter 3. The King Who Wept for War. He was not born to gentleness. not shaped by lullabies or lessons in kindness. Ashoka, the grandson of Chandragupta Maurya, was molded by fire, by the fierce weight of dynasty and ambition, and by a throne that did not welcome softness. In the palaces of Magadha, a kingdom wide as the sky and restless as the wind, the air pulsed with rivalry. Brothers vied for inheritance, ministers whispered in shadows, and the emperor's gaze was sharp and cold, measuring each son like a sword on a scale. Ashoka was not the heir apparent. He was not the favored child, but in his heart burned a storm. While others dressed their ambitions in politeness, Ashoka sharpened his through action. He fought in the provinces, leading battles with fierce precision. His early victories carved his name not in song, but in silence, the silence of those who feared him. They called him Chandashoka, the cruel Ashoka, ruthless, unforgiving. He was a lion stalking the court, patient, calculating, and blooded. But Magadha's lion was not just a brute. He was brilliant. Behind the cold steel of his eyes lay a mind forged in clarity. He studied governance as one studies a battlefield, every weakness, every alliance, every thread in the web of rule. And when the time came, he seized the throne not through birthright, but through force. It was not a coronation bathed in flowers. It was a storm, a settling of debts. And in that moment, Ashoka stood alone, crowned by conquest, but watched by wary hearts. The empire was his. From the icy breath of the Himalayas to the sun-baked shores of Tamil lands, the Mauryan realm stretched vast and powerful. Ashoka reigned like fire on stone, unyielding, absolute. Roads were laid, governors appointed, rebellions silenced. All of India trembled under his steps. And yet he looked eastward, always eastward, toward a land still free, still untouched. Kalinga. The fields of Kalinga. Kalinga was no mighty kingdom, no sprawling capital or ancient dynasty, but it held something Ashoka could not tolerate: defiance. The people of Kalinga were proud, fierce in their independence, unbent by empire. And so Ashoka marched, not out of necessity but principle, not to preserve peace, but to teach a lesson. The armies gathered like clouds. Tens of thousands marched beneath banners of war. The air thickened with the scent of iron and the drumming of feet. Kalinga met them with all it had: warriors, women, children, farmers turned soldiers overnight. What followed was not a battle. It was a storm, a breaking of heaven upon the earth. The rivers ran dark. The trees stood witness, their branches heavy with the cries of the dying. And when it ended, the silence was louder than the war. Over 100,000 lives lost, cities razed, families scattered like ashes in the wind. Ashoka stood upon the field, victorious. But the air did not taste of triumph. The smoke did not smell of glory. It stung. There, among the ruined earth, something within the king cracked. Not a scream, not a thunderous cry, but a stillness, a moment when the soul turns to look at itself. Ashoka saw not just the bodies, he saw the weight of their stories. The mother holding her child in death, the farmer clutching a broken plow, the soldier with eyes still open, staring at nothing, and the silence pressed down, heavier than his crown. Victory had never felt so hollow. The conquest of Kalinga became a mirror, and in it, Ashoka saw not a ruler but a destroyer, not a lion but a shadow. That night, the wind whispered through the ruins, and the king, alone in his tent, wept. The turning of the heart. The transformation was not immediate. There was no divine thunder, no sudden awakening. It was slow, like light returning after storm. Ashoka withdrew from war. He withdrew from vengeance. He began to question the throne itself, what it meant to rule, to hold power not through fear, but through care. It was then that he found the Dharma, not just as a teaching, but as a path. Buddhism had long moved through the land, gentle as a river, speaking of compassion, detachment, and peace. And now, those words found a home in a king's broken heart. Ashoka did not renounce the world, he reshaped it. With clarity, with conviction, he embraced the robes of mercy. He laid down the sword, not in weakness, but in strength. Prisons were emptied of cruelty. Hunting grounds became sanctuaries. Trees were planted along roads so that travelers might rest. Wells were dug so that none would thirst. And every order, every law, every decision began with one quiet question. Is this right? He became a servant of Dharma, a guardian of the good. His court no longer echoed with the clatter of armor, but with the soft voices of scholars, monks, healers. Ashoka was no longer Chandashoka. He was now Dharmashoka, the Ashoka of the Dharma. He sent missions across his vast empire, not with swords but with words. Ambassadors of peace traveled to Sri Lanka, to the Hellenistic West, to every corner that would listen. Not to convert, but to share. Ashoka had conquered once with war. Now he would conquer with kindness. And he did. But even in his peace, the memory of Kalinga remained. Not as guilt, but as anchor. A reminder. A fire that had scorched him, and in doing so, forged something new. Something enduring. The stone that speaks. Ashoka's greatest legacy would not be palaces or armies. It would be words, carved in stone. Across his empire, from mountain paths to riverbanks, pillars rose like silent sentinels. Tall, smooth, simple. Upon them his voice was etched. Edicts not of domination but of care. They spoke of honesty in governance, of kindness to all creatures, of tolerance between beliefs. They urged officials to act with fairness, and families to treat each other with gentleness. They praised compassion above power, and they were written not in high court language, but in the tongue of the people, so that a farmer or traveler might read and feel seen. The pillars were not meant to awe, they were meant to guide. Like lighthouses across the vastness of India, they whispered his truth, that strength without wisdom is hollow, that power without compassion is ruin, and that the greatest victory is over the self. Some were carved with images, lions, wheels, lotuses, symbols of life, of movement, of peace. Others stood plain, the words alone holding weight. Time passed, empires fell, names faded, but the stones remained, weathered by wind, kissed by rain, and still they spoke. Ashoka did not live forever. Like all kings, his body returned to dust. But his dream did not die. The land he ruled remembered. And centuries later, when India would rise again and search for symbols of unity, it was Ashoka's will they would choose. His lion, his words, because there was something eternal in his turning. From conqueror to peacemaker, from lion to pillar, Ashoka's story is not just of rule, but of return. Return to self, to stillness, to what lies beneath the noise. He wept once on a field of war, and from those tears, an empire softened. The wind carries his voice still, not in the sound of armies, but in the hush of stone, in the shade of a tree planted long ago, in the quiet resolve of a ruler who chose mercy, even after power had given him everything. Ashoka reminds us that the greatest kings are not those who take, but those who give, and that sometimes the most powerful chapter begins when the sword is laid down and the heart is finally heard. Chapter 4. The Architect of Empire. The winds were not kind the day Julius Caesar fell. Rome trembled, not with grief, but with the chaos of what would follow. The dictator was gone, stabbed beneath the gaze of statues and senators, his body broken not by war, but by betrayal. And from the dust of this violent silence, a boy stepped forward. His name was Octavian. He was not a soldier, not a hero, not even yet a man of Rome's respect, only a youth with a name that burned like fire through every street and whispering corridor. Caesar's adopted son. He did not inherit a throne. Rome had no crown to pass. What he inherited was more dangerous, a legacy wrapped in blood and ambition. Julius Caesar had left him his name, his wealth, and most crucially, his will. But Octavian knew that power in Rome was not taken with ink or parchment. It was earned in shadows, in alliances forged and broken, and in the unrelenting patience of a serpent who waits, coiled and calm. He was only 18, but even then, he did not cry for the fallen. He calculated. He returned to Rome not as a boy mourning his father, but as a symbol, the last breath of Caesar's vision, wrapped in youth and promise. The Senate did not take him seriously. The old guard saw a child where they expected a soldier. But Octavian saw everything. He read the shifting winds of Rome like scripture. His strength would not come from brute force, but from knowing when to yield and when to strike. And so, in the hush that followed Caesar's death, as Rome teetered between republic and ruin, Octavian began the slow, deliberate path from heir to emperor, not with legions, not yet, but with silence, alliances, and the unbearable weight of a name that refused to die. The triumvirate games. First, he did not stand alone. Power in Rome was not a single man's to hold. To secure his footing, Octavian entered into a fragile alliance, the Second Triumvirate. 3 men, bound not by trust, but by necessity. There was Mark Antony, the warrior once loyal to Caesar, now driven by hunger and passion. And there was Lepidus, quieter, more cautious, a shadow in the corner of the room. Together they promised order. Together they promised justice. Together they would avenge the fallen Caesar. But behind their unity lay old ambitions, barely veiled. The triumvirate was never a brotherhood. It was a temporary ceasefire between men who all dreamed of ruling. Each carried secrets, each held daggers behind their backs. The alliance was written in blood and ended in betrayal, as all such things in Rome often did. Octavian watched. He smiled when necessary, nodded when expected. But inside, he studied Antony's weaknesses, Lepidus's indecision. He did not rush. He waited, like a lion crouched in the grass, letting the older beasts fight, letting them tire. Antony grew reckless, pulled eastward by his love for Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, while Octavian remained in Rome, building his reputation not just as Caesar's son, but as Rome's last hope for peace. When the cracks widened, Octavian widened them more. He turned public opinion like a sculptor turns clay, shaping Antony into a traitor, into a man who had sold his soul to the East. The people listened. The Senate stirred. And when the war finally came, it was not a war of ideals, but of perception. Rome stood behind Octavian, not for who he was, but for what he represented. Order over chaos, Rome over Alexandria. At the Battle of Actium, on windswept seas and beneath darkening skies, Antony and Cleopatra's dreams dissolved in smoke and salt water. They fell not just in defeat, but in irrelevance. And as they faded from history's stage, Octavian stepped forward, alone now, triumphant. He had not roared to power. He had whispered. He had waited. And when the time came, he had struck with such precision that there was no room left for resistance. The games were over. The lion had risen. When power wears a mask. Rome was weary of kings. They had spilled too much blood breaking the chains of monarchy. Even Julius Caesar, who had dared to gather too much power, had paid the price with his life. Octavian knew this. He did not name himself king. He did not wear a crown. Instead, he wrapped himself in titles the people could stomach: Princeps, the first citizen; Augustus, the revered one. He gave the illusion of choice, the mirage of a republic still breathing. But behind the veils, Augustus ruled with unmatched control. The Senate still met. Laws were still passed. Voices still echoed in marble halls. But they were echoes with no weight. Rome had not been conquered, it had been persuaded. Augustus governed not by brute force, but by appearing not to govern at all. He restored temples, honored traditions, praised republican values even as he dismantled them brick by brick. He smiled in public, calm and modest, but behind his stillness was steel. He exiled rivals, removed threats with quiet efficiency. He made war look like peace and obedience look like freedom. Rome flourished and the people cheered, not realizing that the republic they thought they had preserved now stood only as a facade, a stage set to keep them from noticing the emperor behind the curtain. Yet, Augustus did not delight in cruelty. He did not rule like a tyrant, but like a craftsman. Each decision, each policy was carved with care. He wanted more than power, he wanted permanence. He did not want to be a tyrant who ruled for a time. He wanted to be a name etched in eternity. And so, The empire was born, not with a shout but with a breath. Rome did not fall into dictatorship. It walked willingly into it, believing it had been saved. In Augustus's hands, power wore a mask of humility, but its grip was firm and unshakable. Peace carved in marble. What came next was unlike anything the world had seen. The swords were sheathed, the roads lengthened, the walls rose higher. From the ashes of endless civil wars, Augustus offered something Rome had forgotten how to crave: peace. It would be called the Pax Romana. But this was no fragile truce. It was order etched in stone, written in law, measured in time and trade and triumph. Augustus rebuilt the very skeleton of Rome. He found a city of brick and left it clothed in marble. Temples gleamed beneath the sun. Aqueducts stretched across the land like veins, bringing life to the thirsty heart of the empire. Soldiers no longer marched through Rome for war. They built roads, guarded borders, spread the image of the emperor like a sacred fire across continents. He reformed the tax system, the military, the administration. Every corner of the empire began to feel his touch, subtle but lasting. Even in distant provinces, people knew his name. They saw his statues, his coins, his face. Not as a conqueror, but as a father, a shepherd of order, the maker of calm. Under Augustus, Rome did not just survive. It exhaled. Generations grew up never knowing the fear of civil war. Markets bloomed. Arts flourished. Poets wrote of golden ages. And though the shadows of tyranny still lingered, most did not care. Peace had a price, and Rome, tired and scarred, was willing to pay it. He lived long. He ruled wisely. And when he finally passed, his body was wrapped not in gold, but in legacy. The Senate declared him divine. He had built more than an empire. He had crafted an illusion so perfect that even centuries later, it would still shimmer with glory. In the quiet dusk of his reign, the lion no longer needed to hunt. The empire breathed in rhythm with his dream. Augustus had turned survival into sovereignty, chaos into calm, ambition into marble. He had taken a broken republic and, without tearing it down, built an empire upon its bones, slow, subtle, eternal. Chapter 5: The Cross and the Crown. He was born at the edge of an empire split down its spine. The world into which Constantine opened his eyes was not the glory-filled Rome of legends, but a fractured giant, groaning beneath the weight of ambition, treachery, and weary gods. His father, Constantius Chlorus, was a Caesar of the West, a man of stern resolve and military will. But even with power in his blood, Constantine's childhood was not wrapped in ease. Instead, it was wrapped in watchfulness. As a boy, he grew in the eastern court of Diocletian, an emperor whose reforms had torn the empire into 4 governing hands, a tetrarchy built to prevent chaos. But even order, Constantine would learn, can disguise quiet desperation. Within these courts, he studied the art of diplomacy and the cold calculation of survival. He watched men smile with their lips while their eyes measured enemies. He watched rulers plant trust like a dagger, only to twist it later when the time was ripe. He learned to stay silent, to think slowly, and to ride not just horses but the tide of power. Even from his youth, he was a figure who drew both loyalty and suspicion. To some, he seemed destined, tall, composed, with a gaze that drifted toward horizons. But destiny is dangerous when others believe it may not include them. The path ahead of him would be lit not by torches, but by the burning eyes of rivals. When his father called for him in Gaul, Constantine fled the eastern court with haste. The story goes that he slipped away in the dead of night, taking the imperial stables one by one so no rider could chase him. Each hoofbeat into the west echoed his future, a future not of shadows, but of fire. In the wild hills of Britain, he rejoined his father, just as sickness began to claim him. And when the elder emperor died, it was Constantine whom the soldiers hailed. But Rome did not accept sons so easily. He had not been appointed by the tetrarchy. Others ruled with titles, and they would not yield them lightly. War was inevitable, not just of blades, but of faith, of order, of vision. Constantine would not merely inherit power. He would wrestle it from history's grip, a bridge lit by stars. The sky does not always speak, but when it does, the world listens. It was the autumn of 312, and Constantine rode toward Rome. He faced Maxentius, a rival who held the ancient capital in hand, fortified and proud. The road to the city coiled through years of blood and betrayal. Yet, on the eve of battle, something changed. Constantine, though still a man of many gods, had begun to hear whispers, from his mother Helena, from Christian soldiers in his ranks, from something deeper. He had asked the heavens for a sign, and then, they say, the heavens answered. A vision, or perhaps a dream. A light that burned across the sky like a cross, crowned by the words in Hoc Signo Vinces. In this sign you will conquer. Others said it appeared as a Chiro, the Greek letters for Christ. Some claim it was a dream sent by Christ himself. Others say it was a celestial omen read only by those willing to believe. But Constantine believed. He had the sign painted on the shields of his men. He rode with it before him as though it were a blade of fire, parting doubt and fear. And as the armies clashed at the Milvian Bridge, where the Tiber flowed silver and cold beneath the weight of legions, the tide turned. Maxentius was defeated, his troops routed, his body found drowned among the reeds. Rome opened its gates to Constantine, not as a conqueror of land, but as something greater, a bearer of divine favor. That night, Rome did not just fall into his hands, fell into his vision. The cross had not only guided his sword, it had rewritten his soul. Baptized by empire, now the world waited to see. Would the emperor serve the gods of old, or the god of new light? Constantine stood at the edge of two worlds. Behind him lay the shrines of Jupiter and Mars, the traditions of 1,000 years. Ahead, the cross. The Christian faith had long been a persecuted river running beneath Rome's foundations, but Constantine lifted it into the sun. He issued the Edict of Milan in 313, a declaration of tolerance, freedom, and peace for all faiths, but especially for Christians. No longer would their gatherings be whispered. No longer would their symbols be carved in secret. The faith that once survived in catacombs now echoed in the halls of power. But Constantine was not merely a convert. He was a commander. His Christianity was imperial, sweeping, and often strategic. He saw the power of unity in belief, a force that could hold together the shattered limbs of empire. He called for councils to resolve disputes in doctrine. He dressed bishops in robes that mirrored senators. He funded the building of great churches, their domes rising like holy mountains above Rome and beyond. Yet the waters of faith are never still. He was not baptized until the end of his life, perhaps out of tradition or out of caution. Perhaps he waited for the right moment when he could step fully into the river with no more battles to fight. But whether by conviction, by calculation, or both, Constantine changed the soul of the empire. The ruler of Rome now walked beneath a cross, not as a slave but as a sovereign, the city of the future. But Constantine did not trust Rome. She had loved too many emperors and murdered too many. Her streets echoed with the cries of forgotten Caesars. Her heart beat with the pulse of ancient gods. He sought a new beginning and found it in the east. Byzantium, an old Greek port with hills that touched the sea and winds that smelled of prophecy. It stood between worlds, at the mouth of Europe and the gates of Asia. Here, Constantine saw not a city but a future. He rebuilt it in his name, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. He called it Nova Roma, New Rome, but it became more than that. Marble roads stretched beneath arches of triumph. Churches rose beside forums. Palaces watched the Bosphorus with eyes like stone. And at its center, Constantine placed relics and symbols. The lance of destiny, fragments of the true cross, statues of Apollo refashioned as Christian guardians. Pagan and Christian, past and future, all woven together in one glowing tapestry of empire. Here, he dreamed of a city that would not fall, one that would stand as the capital of Christian Rome, long after the old one crumbled. And for more than 1,000 years, it did. Even as the West grew cold and broken, Constantinople remained a lighthouse on the shore of time. When Constantine died in 337, he was buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles, not as a god like emperors before him, but as a man under the cross. a ruler baptized into both water and memory. His crown laid beside the cross he had once seen in the sky. The empire he left behind was not perfect. Fractured, rose and fell. But something deeper had been planted, a shift in the stars themselves. The Roman world was no longer ruled by emperors alone, but by conscience, belief, and the flicker of eternal light. And in the quiet, sacred shadow of Constantinople, the future waited, watching the stars, listening for the voice that once whispered over a bridge. Chapter 6. The Iron King of the North. The dawn was gray and heavy over the Frankish lands, as if the sky itself hesitated to open its eyes. Across the slow-turning rivers and through the hush of deep pine forests, the air whispered of transition. In the heart of the kingdom, one man sat beneath the weight of both history and fate, a tall figure with a warrior's strength and a thinker's silence. Charlemagne, son of Pepin the Short, stood not as a boy of inheritance, but as a man bound to a fractured crown. At his father's passing, the realm had been split, shared between Charles and his brother Carloman. 2 sons, 1 legacy, and an uncertain future. But unity, as history often reveals, chooses strange paths. When Carloman died young and unexpectedly, it was not merely grief that rippled across the land, but opportunity. Some saw danger in Charles's rising strength. Others saw destiny. With careful maneuvering and an iron resolve, Charlemagne absorbed his brother's domain, not by ruthless conquest, but by a mixture of diplomacy, strategy, and silent force. He would not be a half-king. He would not let the dream of a unified Frankish kingdom dissolve into feuding bloodlines and forgotten oaths. The lands came together like ancient stones fitted into a Roman arch, sturdy, austere, unyielding. And with this unity came a vision. Charlemagne did not seek a throne merely to rule. He sought a throne upon which he could stand tall enough to reshape the world beneath him. Through the valleys of Gaul and over the windswept Alps, he rode, a lone figure against the long shadow of Rome's fallen grandeur. A king not born of marble palaces, but forged in the smoke of village hearths and battlefields. This was no age of gold, but within it he would hammer out something enduring, something vast. Cross and sword. The cross and the sword rode side by side beneath Charlemagne's banner, symbols of 2 mighty powers, heaven and earth. To him, they were not at odds. They were tools of the same mission. As he expanded his realm beyond the Rhine and into the thick, pagan woods of Saxony, the Iron King did not only conquer people, he converted them. With each battle won, churches were raised where shrines had stood. With each rebellion quelled, the river waters ran with baptisms. Some called him a holy warrior, others a tyrant in robes. But in the quiet of his campfires, Charlemagne often spoke with monks as he did with generals. He believed in a kingdom bound not just by loyalty, but by a shared soul. The Christian faith was not merely his own, it was his empire's spine. And when words failed, when persuasion met resistance, he turned to the sharp language of steel. In the long wars against the Saxons, year after year, he waged campaigns not simply to win land, but to shape identity. Villages burned, fortresses rose, and through it all, the fields soaked in both rain and blood. Yet from this turmoil, a vision emerged. An empire where Latin prayers echoed from stone chapels in once hostile lands. A people united not by race or tongue, but by creed and law. It was a costly dream, and not all sang hymns willingly. But the Iron King, as he would be remembered, did not believe that civilization could wait for peace. It had to be forged, sometimes in fire. Still, in the quiet of monasteries far from the battlefield, his conquests were recorded not as mere wars, but as missions. The scribes would remember a king who brought faith to wild frontiers, a man who wore the cross upon his shield, not just around his neck. And when the dust settled, and churches stood where trees once whispered of old gods, Charlemagne's empire took a breath, half in fear, half in awe. The winter crown. There are moments in history when time itself seems to pause, when breath meets silence, and the world shifts beneath a single footstep. One such morning came cloaked in cold and reverence. It was the year 800, and Rome, the ancient mother of empires, lay shivering beneath the winter sky. Charlemagne entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim. His hands carried offerings, not chains. Yet what he would receive would bind him to eternity. In the great church of St. Peter's, as incense spiraled into the cold air, the Pope himself, Leo III, rose with solemn hands and placed a crown upon Charlemagne's head. An unexpected gesture, some say, but history remembers it as fate. Emperor of the Romans, he was called. Not since the days of the Caesars had anyone dared wear that title in the West. But now, in this sacred space, a king of the Franks became a ruler of empires. The crown was not golden, not dazzling. It was made of iron, heavy, unforgiving, a symbol not of vanity, but of burden. It was a crown fit for a man who built roads through forested kingdoms and lit torches in centuries darkened by war. With that coronation, the past and the future shook hands. The ghost of Rome was given flesh again, and Europe, broken and wandering, felt a pulse return to its limbs. Outside the basilica, the people murmured with awe. Snowflakes drifted like feathers from heaven. The streets whispered with the echoes of something ancient, reborn. And within Charlemagne, the weight of that crown settled not as pride, but as purpose. He had not asked for the title, but he would bear it, not as the end of his story, but as the spine of a new one. The Roman dream, worn down by centuries, had been lifted again, not by an emperor of silk and marble, but by a king of fields and fire. The schools of the king. Beneath the grandeur of conquest and the weight of empire, there lived another side of Charlemagne, quieter, but no less enduring. In the quiet cloisters of monasteries, in the candlelit chambers of scholars, and in the laughter of children learning to read, he planted seeds that no army could trample. The king believed that without learning, his empire would be hollow. And so, he built not only roads and churches, he built minds. In Aachen, his court became a beacon. He gathered thinkers from distant lands, Alcuin of York, Paul the Deacon, and others scholars whose pens carried the wisdom of ages. Charlemagne himself, though not a fluent reader in early years, studied humbly beside them. His curiosity was insatiable. He asked questions not just of strategy, but of language, astronomy, and theology. He saw in education a kind of immortality, a flame that could light the centuries. He ordered that every cathedral and monastery have a school, that children, not only of nobles but of common folk, be taught. Latin, grammar, arithmetic. These were not luxuries to him. They were necessities, tools to shape a people who could think, reason, and remember. The Carolingian Renaissance, as it would later be known, was not a flood of marble statues or dramatic revolutions. It was a soft, steady rekindling. A scribe copying Virgil by lamplight, a monk teaching a farm boy to write his name, a king asking what justice should look like, not just on paper, but in a village dispute. Through law, learning, and letters, Charlemagne carved a path through the fog of the Dark Ages. His empire was not only one of borders, it was one of thought. And though the lands he ruled would fracture after his death, the vision he sowed of a united Europe, of a shared intellectual heritage, would echo in the centuries that followed. From university halls to law courts, his influence lingers still, not as a ghost, but as a gentle presence in the foundations of the West. In the end, the Iron King was not just a warrior or a ruler. He was a builder of bridges between tribes, of trust between peoples, of dreams that outlasted his own shadow. And when the fires of his age dimmed, what remained were not the swords, but the stories. Not the banners, but the books. He rode with the weight of an empire on his shoulders, but in his heart, he carried the fragile hope that civilization could be taught, protected, and passed on like a flame through the darkness. And so, as the stars wheeled quietly over the land once called Gaul, and the rivers whispered past old Roman stones, the world remembered a man who wore a simple iron crown and dreamed like a king of light. Chapter 7. The King of the Burning Shore. There is a place where the rivers run slow and red with silt, where the desert breathes heat into the bones of stone, and where gold sleeps beneath the earth like fire waiting to be born. West Africa, in the Age of Kingdoms, was not silent. It thrummed with trade, with stories, with the footfalls of caravans that stitched together the fate of cities and the dreams of kings. And from this land of sun and soil came a man whose name would outshine the very treasure he carried. His name was Musa, Mansa Musa, king of Mali, lord of rivers, salt, and gold. He was not born into thunder. He rose like a slow dawn, steady, brilliant, without need for bloodshed. The land he ruled was already rich, but under his hand it bloomed into something deeper. His people called the earth sacred, for it gave them gold like tears from the sky, soft, bright, unending. But Musa did not hoard it as a dragon might. No, he believed gold was not meant to be buried. It was a bridge to faith, to knowledge, to peace. Mali was more than a kingdom. It was a crossroads of stories. Traders whispered of its wealth, but what they did not always say, and perhaps did not understand, was that its wealth was not just in gold. It was in quiet order, in the way Musa listened more than he spoke, in the way justice traveled alongside camels and silence followed his steps like a prayer. He was not a king who shouted. He was a king who saw, not only the land beneath his feet, but the stars above his people's heads. And so, in the hush of hot winds and under the watchful eye of the Sahara, a dream formed in his heart. A journey not to conquer, but to give. A pilgrimage that would change the world's imagination of Africa forever. The journey of 10,000. When Mansa Musa decided to perform the Hajj, the sacred pilgrimage to Mecca, he did not go alone. He moved like a mirage made real, with an entourage so vast that the desert itself seemed to ripple in astonishment. Over 60,000 people, they say. Thousands of attendants, soldiers, and slaves. Camels so heavily laden with gold that the very dust they kicked up glittered. It was not merely travel. It was spectacle. It was scripture carved in sunlight. He crossed the vast Sahara, a place where silence is the loudest sound, and every grain of sand is a memory. Through heat that melted time, Musa's caravan moved eastward, guided by stars and the rhythm of prayers. His was a journey of worship, but also of wonder. Wherever he went, he gave. He gave gold to the poor. He built mosques. He met rulers not with pride but with grace. And the world looked up. In Cairo, the weight of his generosity bent the markets. So much gold poured into the streets that it caused inflation. Prices soared and did not settle for a decade. Gold lost its sheen simply because Musa had given so much of it away. Imagine that. A man so wealthy, so open-handed, that he disrupted the economy of a continent by kindness alone. And yet, this was never his aim. For Musa, giving was a form of prayer. Gold, like water, was meant to flow. From Egypt to Arabia, from Medina to Mecca, his name traveled ahead of him. But it was not just the gold that people remembered. It was the way he carried himself, not as a tyrant, but as a servant of God. Not as a showman, but as a seeker. His pilgrimage was not about arrival. It was about journeying with humility, with splendor used not to elevate the self, but to reflect the greatness of the divine. When he returned, he brought back more than stories. He brought scholars, architects, poets, and ideas. He brought a vision of what Mali could become. Not just a land of riches, but a land of wisdom. The desert behind him bore his footprints. The cities before him waited to be born. Cities of sand and wisdom. Timbuktu, a name now wrapped in myth, but once as real as wind across dunes. Before Musa, it was known. After Musa, it became sacred. He turned it into a lighthouse, not of ships, but of souls. A city where books were more valuable than gold. A place where silence was filled not with emptiness, but with the scratch of ink, the murmur of learning, the hush of minds opening like petals at dawn. He built mosques that rose like palms in the desert, calling the faithful not with force, but with beauty. The Jingareber Mosque, crafted with local mud and wisdom imported from the east, became a jewel in the sand. But more than stone and structure, he built institutions. He endowed libraries, welcomed scholars from as far as Cairo and Fez, and invited the world to come and sit beneath the Malian sun and think. Children learned beside their elders. Astronomers studied the sky while scribes preserved the past. It was not noise that made Timbuktu powerful. It was depth, quiet depth, the kind that echoes longer than drums. There, in the heart of Africa, ideas flourished like oases. Mansa Musa understood something timeless, that wealth without wisdom fades, that cities without purpose crumble. So he sowed his riches not into walls alone, but into minds. He did not fear education, he fed it. And so Timbuktu and later Gao and other cities became more than capitals. They became vessels. They carried the light of Islam, the light of learning, and the memory of a king who chose not only to rule, but to uplift. He had no need to boast. The cities spoke for him. They stood not as monuments to ego, but as gardens planted by vision. And while gold may shimmer in the sun, the words that passed through those libraries shimmered in time, a legacy paved in gold. Centuries have passed since Mansa Musa walked this earth, yet his name still stirs like wind through the dunes. His image appears on old maps, sometimes exaggerated with a crown too large or a scepter too grand. But beyond the embellishments lies a truth that doesn't fade, that there once lived a king whose greatness came not from conquest, but from care. The world often remembers power through violence, through battlefields and empires built on the bones of others. But Musa's story reminds us that there is another way. His power was quiet. His riches did not make him cruel. They made him curious. His strength was not in how many he ruled, but in how much he gave. The gold of Mali no longer flows as it once did. The great caravans have vanished. The pages of old manuscripts gather dust. But his legacy is not buried. It is breathed. In every story of Africa's past, his light lingers. It glows in the idea that greatness can come not through fear, but through generosity. Not through war, but through wisdom. Not through spectacle, but through purpose. The burning shore from which he rose, that stretch of land kissed by both the desert and the sea, still whispers his name. Children in faraway lands hear of him in classrooms. Artists sketch his likeness in gold. And the sands, though ever shifting, still carry the trace of his journey. Mansa Musa did not set out to be remembered, but he lived in such a way that forgetting him became impossible. His story is not just African. It is human. It speaks to something deep, that the truest kings are those who build, who teach, who give, and who believe that wealth, when shared, becomes something greater than treasure. It becomes legacy. And so, let the night fall gently now, with the image of a caravan winding across the desert, golden in the dying sun. Let the memory of a king who walked humbly with riches at his feet lull you into dreams of cities made of light and wisdom blooming in the sand. Let the stars above whisper softly, as they did to him, and remind you that the greatest stories are not always the loudest, but the ones that shine, quietly, forever. Chapter 8. The King Who Fought the Sea. Alfred was never meant to wear a crown. He was the youngest son in a line of kings who ruled over parts of a land too scattered to be called a nation. In the green hills of Wessex, far from the politics of great courts or the noise of battle, he was a quiet child, thoughtful, delicate, drawn more to books than to swords. His earliest days were spent in the glow of candlelight beside his mother, learning to read the holy words of the Psalms. While other boys learned to ride or spar, Alfred listened, watched, and prayed. He studied Latin. He memorized scripture. And in the hush of his youth, something soft but unbreakable took root in him. Not power, not ambition, but purpose. The kind of purpose that grows slowly, like ivy on old stone, unnoticed until it holds everything together. But the world around him did not care for peace. From the cold north came ships shaped like serpents, carved with dragon heads, bearing warriors whose gods were made of thunder and iron. The Norse raiders burned what they could not take. Churches crumbled. Monks were slaughtered. The air smelled of smoke, and the rivers ran red. Alfred was still a boy when he saw the fury of a storm that would never stop chasing him. The Viking storm. One by one, his elder brothers died, each pulled into battle and buried beneath broken banners. And so, the child once thought too gentle to rule stood alone, the last son of Wessex, crowned not with glory but with burden. His faith, once a comfort, became his compass. He prayed not to be mighty, but to be wise. In the dark nights of exile and retreat, he did not ask for vengeance. He asked for endurance. And so, Alfred's journey did not begin in triumph. It began in fire and ash, and in the quiet, unwavering belief that a king does not need to be born for the crown, only called to it. The Viking storm. When the tide rose, it came like thunder on black sails. The great heathen army, as they were called, swept across the English kingdoms like a flood, consuming Northumbria, breaking Mercia, and threatening to drown Wessex. Alfred fought, but the storm was too strong. Again and again his armies were scattered. Again and again, the earth beneath his feet seemed to vanish. In the bitter winter of 878, he vanished too, into the marshes of Somerset, a king without a throne, hiding in the fog like a ghost of a lost land. There, among the reeds and mist, the legend of Alfred began to take shape. He wandered in disguise, protected only by a few loyal men. Hungry, weary, hunted but never broken. It was said that he once stayed with a peasant woman who asked him to watch her bread while it baked. Distracted by thoughts of battle, he let it burn. She scolded him, not knowing she scolded a king, but Alfred took it without anger. He understood he had let his land burn too. And yet, even in the marshes, he began to plan. He built a hidden stronghold at Athelney. He sent out messages to the scattered warriors of Wessex, calling them to rise once more. Like a heartbeat returning after silence, his kingdom stirred. The people had not forgotten him. In the spring, they gathered at Egbert's Stone, where the green woods opened to reveal the dawn of hope. Alfred rode at their head, not as a conqueror, but as a shepherd guiding the last flock. At the Battle of Edington, the storm met the stone. Alfred, with fewer men, stood his ground against Guthrum, the Viking warlord, and he did not fall. He won not just with swords, but with spirit. He broke the Viking advance, drove them back, and forced peace. Guthrum converted to Christianity, baptized with Alfred as his godfather. The storm had not ended, but it had been turned. And in that turning, Alfred proved that resistance, when rooted in faith and reason, could become more powerful than fire. Walls of earth and law. With peace came not rest, but rebuilding. Alfred knew that victory meant nothing without protection. So he built walls not only to guard against swords, but to guard against despair. Across Wessex and beyond, he raised buzz, fortified towns laid out with care, connected by roads, guarded by garrisons, and filled with farmers and tradesmen who could flee inside when danger came. These were more than strongholds. They were seeds of a future city life, where people could live not in fear, but in community. But stone alone could not hold a kingdom. Alfred turned to law. He gathered old customs, shaped them with Christian ethics, and formed a code that balanced mercy and justice. He was not content with the rule of force. He wanted the rule of wisdom. He translated sacred texts from Latin into English so that his people could read and understand. He invited scholars from distant lands to teach, to write, to build schools where none had stood. He believed that ignorance was as dangerous as the sword. This was a different kind of war. Alfred fought not only with arms, but with ideas. He believed that the spirit of a people could be fortified just as their towns could. He spoke of unity, not conquest, of learning, not domination. And through his vision, the brokenness of England began to stitch itself back together, not as one kingdom yet, but as something possible, something dreamed. The walls Alfred built were not just of earth. They were of language, of justice, of memory. And long after his death, those invisible walls would still stand, holding back the chaos, holding up the dream. The seed of a kingdom. Alfred never ruled a united England. The north remained under Viking control, and the vision of one land, one crown was still far away. But like a farmer who sows in frost, he planted something that would grow long after he was gone. His children and grandchildren would carry his legacy. His son Edward, his daughter Ethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians, and his grandson Athelstan, who would one day be called the first king of all England. What Alfred gave was not dominion, but direction. He showed that a king could lead with humility, That strength could be quiet. That wisdom could be more lasting than fear. His enemies feared his cunning more than his sword. His people loved him for his fairness more than his force. He died in 899, his body weary from years of war and illness. But he left behind a people who could read, who could build, who could believe again. He left behind towns that would become cities, laws that would become traditions, and a vision of England not as a battleground, but as a homeland. In the centuries that followed, others would rise. Normans, Plantagenets, Tudors. But beneath their crowns and castles would always lie Alfred's foundation. Invisible, quiet, enduring. He was the king who fought the sea. Not just the waves of raiders, but the tides of chaos and ignorance. And though he did not live to see the full shape of the island kingdom, his hand drew its first lines. And so, in the hush of history, Alfred the Great stands. Not on a battlefield, not in a palace, but in the soil, the schools, the stories of a nation that, against all odds, learned to endure. Let the night settle gently, like the mist over Somerset, and remember, greatness does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers from the marshes and shapes the world. Chapter 9, The Emperor of Two Worlds. He was born into the thunder of hooves and the scent of iron, a child of the steppe, swaddled not in silks, but in the open wind. Kublai Khan, grandson of the great Genghis, opened his eyes in a world that trembled beneath the shadow of conquest. The Mongol Empire stretched wide across the earth, a living breath of war and dust. But within young Kublai stirred a quieter hunger, not for devastation, but for understanding. Where other boys learned to fire arrows on horseback and read the language of wolves, Kublai listened to scholars. He studied histories, philosophies, and faiths of the many peoples his family had conquered. His mind wandered far beyond the yurts and battlefields. There was a gentleness in him, strange and unspoken, like a pause in the gallop of a storm. He loved the way ideas could travel further than armies, how ink could last longer than blood. Yet still, he rode beside his brothers, sword in hand, learning to lead in the language of conquest. His heart was torn between two winds, one that howled with the call of warriors, and one that whispered of ancient books and walled cities. Kublai walked that thin edge, not knowing yet where it would lead him. He was a child made of two dreams, one of fire, one of light. And in time, those dreams would not remain separate. They would collide. The crown of the Middle Kingdom. China had always been a prize, a world of wonders, a land of ancient glory, rivers curled like dragons, and palaces brimming with centuries of poetry. But it had also been divided, fractured between dynasties and ideals. Kublai, now grown and tempered, understood that to take China with swords alone would only make him a conqueror. To rule it, he would have to become something else entirely. He led the Mongol armies into the heart of Song China, where resistance was fierce and the terrain unforgiving. The conquest was long, brutal, and costly, yet Kublai did not merely burn and march forward. He began to adopt the wisdom of his enemies. He retained officials who had once served the Song. He studied Chinese statecraft, embraced Confucian ideals, and surrounded himself with advisors who challenged his own way of seeing the world. When the Song dynasty finally fell, it was not the cry of a single battle, but the soft surrender of a world that had been outlasted. Kublai crowned himself not as a Mongol warlord, but as the son of heaven, the rightful emperor of China. In 1271, he declared the beginning of the Yuan dynasty. It was not just a new era, it was a new identity. Kublai wore the crown of the Middle Kingdom, not merely on his head, but within. He had crossed a threshold where most could not follow, from nomad to sovereign, from fire to harmony. His empire would no longer be driven only by thunder. It would be stitched together with silk, the city of heaven. To rule such an empire, Kublai needed a center, not a camp or a tent, but a true capital that could reflect the union of his two worlds. And so, beneath the sky of the north, the city of Dadu was born, the city that would become Beijing. It rose from the earth like a dream. Wide, straight avenues replaced the winding paths of old. Palaces with golden roofs shimmered like suns resting on stone. Gardens stretched with fragrant order, and temples rose like prayers etched in brick. Here, Kublai built not just buildings, but a vision. This would be the pulse of an empire where merchants, scholars, poets, and priests could all walk beneath one sky. Caravans arrived from Samarkand, from Persia, from India and beyond. Silk flowed westward. Spices, stories, and glass came east. At Dadu's heart stood the imperial court, where languages tangled like vines, and maps stretched over tables larger than any battlefield. Even the sea answered his call. Kublai supported expeditions to the southern coasts and beyond, seeking to chart the edges of the known world. His gates opened not just to conquerors, but to thinkers. Buddhist monks, Persian astronomers, Christian emissaries, and Islamic mathematicians found welcome in his halls. And then came a Venetian Marco Polo, whose writings would carry the wonder of Kublai's realm back to Europe. He called it the most magnificent empire he had ever seen. Kublai had become, in the eyes of strangers, not just a Mongol Khan, but the ruler of a world that seemed mythical in its scale. The empire beyond nomads. But as the city bloomed and the court glittered, a quiet distance grew between Kublai and the steppe. He had once ridden with warriors beneath open skies, his hands calloused from the reins. Now he sat upon thrones, surrounded by parchment, ritual, and the weight of rule. Some Mongol nobles whispered that he had gone soft, too Chinese, too distant from the traditions of his ancestors. But Kublai had chosen his path. He did not wish merely to extend the empire of the Mongols. He wanted to build something that would endure, not just through fear, but through wonder. He reformed tax systems, built granaries, repaired canals, and supported the arts. He believed that a stable people were stronger than a restless army. Yet even so, cracks appeared. Rebellions simmered. The vastness of his realm made it hard to hold. And grief visited him. His wife died, and so did his favorite son. In his final years, Kublai grew heavier, quieter, cloaked in silk but also in sorrow. Still, the vision he carved into the world did not fade. For a moment in history, he became a bridge between nomad and emperor, conquest and civilization, past and future. He was not Genghis. He was something else. A sovereign not of one people, but of many. Kublai Khan, the emperor of two worlds, had taken the fire of the steppe and cooled it into the calm of a throne. His legacy was not just in what he conquered, but in what he built. And though empires fall and cities crumble, the story of a man who dreamed across borders lingers like the echo of distant hooves fading into the quiet hush of a palace courtyard. Chapter 10. The Sun That Never Set. In the dim candlelight of 1638, as the rain whispered softly across the rooftops of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a breathless France exhaled in unison. After years of loss, rebellion, and uncertain succession, the miracle had arrived. A child born not just of royal blood, but of prayer and prophecy. Louis Dieudonné, gift of God. His name alone shimmered with divine promise, and to many, he was just that. A beacon to guide the country from chaos into order. His birth was hailed like a sunrise after a storm, and from his very first cries, courtiers whispered of destiny. France at the time was fractured. A great kingdom tugged between the hands of nobles, clergy, and the growing unrest of a restless people. The 30 Years' War was burning across the continent, and at home, the memory of civil wars and failed heirs still haunted the halls of the Louvre. But this child, small, pink, blinking up at the gold-painted ceilings, was the hope around which a nation might reshape itself. He was not just the son of and of Austria and Louis XIII. He was the answer to France's fear of fading. As Louis grew, his world was not one of childish innocence. His father, the king, died when Louis was just 5. The crown was placed upon the child's head, but the hands that held the reins belonged to others. Most notably, Cardinal Mazarin, the Italian-born minister who guarded the kingdom with a shrewd mind and a tight grip. Louis watched closely, quietly. While Mazarin ruled, the boy observed the machinery of power, how it could be twisted, directed, softened, or sharpened. France was his inheritance, but he would learn to make it his masterpiece. In the silent chambers of royal palaces and the riotous streets of Paris, the young king understood something early. Majesty was not just inherited, it was performed. Glory had to be seen, heard, and shaped like a sculpture in the sun. Even as a child, Louis was learning not just how to rule, but how to be seen as irreplaceable, divine, eternal, and luminous. I am the state. The year was 1661, and Mazarin, the cardinal who had guarded France and guided Louis, was gone. The court trembled with expectation, waiting for the name of the next minister who would rise behind the throne. But none came. For Louis XIV, the moment had finally arrived. He did not need a minister. He was the throne. With a still, commanding voice, the young monarch declared, "L'état, c'est moi. I am the state." This was not simply rhetoric. It was revolution by silence. No upheaval, no bloodshed, just a new way of ruling. From that moment forward, all power would radiate from him, like sunlight from a single source. The councils, the courtiers, the military, and the clergy, all answered not to a ministry, but to the king himself. In one quiet gesture, Louis became more than a man. He became an embodiment of France itself. Each morning, he rose with ceremony. His lever, the ritual of waking, was a theater of power. Courtiers gathered just to hand him his shirt or pass him his shoes. Every act, no matter how mundane, became a statement. Here is the center of the world, and he ruled with tireless precision. He read reports, signed edicts, inspected armies, arranged marriages, and issued taxes. France moved to the rhythm of his will, as planets orbit a star. But his rule was not solely about domination, it was about design. He orchestrated control with such elegance that even those who were tamed by it felt as if they were dancing. Nobles who once plotted rebellions now vied for the chance to hold a candlestick in his presence. Louis understood that true power was not taken by force, it was made irresistible. France flourished and suffered in equal measure. Trade routes expanded, military victories stacked like trophies, and royal academies bloomed. Yet behind the pageantry, shadows coiled, of overreach, of debt, of silence enforced by spectacle. And still, the Sun King shone, unwavering in his brilliance. The Palace of Mirrors. To understand Louis is to walk the halls of Versailles, a palace not built for comfort, but for command. Rising from marshland outside Paris, this glittering monument of gold, marble, and illusion became the very soul of absolutism. But Versailles was more than a palace. It was a mirror, reflecting Louis's vision, hiding his vulnerabilities, and dazzling all who entered. Its long, echoing halls gleamed with chandeliers and painted ceilings. Gods, battles, and mythic symbols bathed in light. The Hall of Mirrors itself was a masterpiece of message. Glass and grandeur combining to say, "Look at what I have built, and see yourself reflected in my glory." Every angle was intentional. There were no corners where rebellion could hide, no silence not filled by music or murmurs of admiration. The nobles were brought close, but never too close. Louis understood their vanity, their ambition, their hunger for favor. So he gave them games, dances, hunts, feasts, and titles, keeping them occupied in a labyrinth of etiquette and pageantry. While they chased prestige, he ruled without obstruction. He had turned politics into performance, and performance into prison. Even time bowed to him. The court followed his daily rhythms. Meals, meetings, ballets, all choreographed to serve the narrative of a divine king in perfect control. Behind the marble, however, there were hidden doors, secret staircases, and lonely rooms. For all its brilliance, Versailles was also a place of surveillance, and the king its most watchful inhabitant. It is easy to be awed by the gold and gardens, to lose oneself in the dream. But Versailles was not just a vision of beauty, it was a fortress of will. Every mirror in the palace did not just reflect the king, they refracted the truth. And as years passed, the glass remained polished, but the reflections began to crack. The burden of light. The light of the sun is not always gentle. As Louis aged, The golden aura he had cultivated began to weigh heavy upon the land. His wars, once glorious and unifying, became long and exhausting. France bled soldiers and gold into the soil of Europe, chasing territories, rivalries, and legacy. Each campaign brought victories, but also famine, tax burdens, and grief. The people who once sang of his greatness now whispered of hunger. To fund his vision, taxes climbed like ivy up the walls of every household. The peasants bore the cost of palaces and parades. Protest was muffled, but pain endured in silence. Fields lay fallow, towns faded, and families scattered. The light that once inspired now seared. Even within the court, eyes began to avert, smiles grew thinner. Louis remained firm, proud, unwavering. But time erodes even the brightest throne. He suffered losses that no crown could ease. His son, his grandson, his beloved wife, taken by disease and sorrow. The halls of Versailles, once echoing with music, now often fell into ghostly quiet. His back hunched, his steps slowed, and though the ceremonies continued, the man behind the myth was growing frail. In his final years, Louis XIV saw the cost of his splendor. He had built a France that no longer revolted, but also one that could barely breathe. Still, he gave no apologies. He remained the sun, constant, brilliant, and distant. On his deathbed, he whispered to his heir, "Do not imitate me in my love of building, nor in my fondness for war." It was not quite repentance, but perhaps a final glimmer of reflection. The sun did not set with violence or fanfare. It dimmed slowly, gently. On September 1st, 1715, after a reign of 72 years, the longest in European history, Louis XIV passed away. Versailles darkened. The mirrors remained. The candles flickered, and France stood between the shimmer of legend and the truth of legacy. He had lived as a symbol, reigned as a spectacle, and died as a man. And as sleep settles over the world once more, we are left to ponder. Was the sun meant to shine so long, or merely to teach us how to see in the dark? Chapter 11: The Philosopher King of Prussia. The corridors of the Prussian court echoed with footsteps of power, yet one voice rarely rose above the polished hush. That voice belonged to a boy named Frederick. From the outside, he appeared shaped in the mold of a soldier's son. A stiff posture, a tidy uniform, and the constant scrutiny of his father, King Frederick William I, the Soldier King. But beneath the rigid layers of military drills and regimented days, there lived a quiet longing, pressed like a rose between the pages of a forbidden book. From a young age, Frederick was not drawn to muskets and maneuvers. He was drawn to music, the soft breath of a flute, the elegance of language, the pages of French philosophy. His heart beat not in time with marching drums, but in rhythm with poetry and thought. Yet, in the brutal, masculine order of his father's world, these things were seen as softness, dangerous softness. The Soldier King punished sensitivity as if it were rebellion. He hurled insults at Frederick's books, beat him for playing the flute, and publicly humiliated him in the eyes of the court. But still, the boy persisted. In secret, he wrote. In darkness, he read. He corresponded with minds that lived far beyond the cold palaces of Prussia, with Voltaire, the French philosopher whose wit carved truth like a scalpel. He dreamed of a world where reason was king, not brutality. And yet, paradoxically, he was being trained, forged, even to become a warrior. His mind reached for light, while the hands that guided him clung to iron. One day, Frederick tried to flee. He and a friend attempted escape across the border, a desperate gasp for freedom. But they were caught. The punishment was not gentle. Frederick was imprisoned in a fortress. His friend was executed before his eyes. The message was clear. Sensitivity was weakness. Obedience was survival. When he was released, the dreamer did not vanish. But he buried himself deeper. He learned to wear silence like armor. He played the flute at dawn when no one listened. He penned essays behind bolted doors. And all the while he watched and waited, not for revenge but for power. Because Frederick had learned something more enduring than rebellion. Patience. And one day the crown would be his. A crown of fire. In 1740, the crown passed from the father to the son, and with it 1,000 contradictions. Frederick, now king, wore the uniform of Prussia with practiced ease. He saluted, he drilled his soldiers, he walked among statues of Mars. But inside, he remained a philosopher, now cloaked in command. Barely had the dust settled on his coronation when the king made his first move. War. The prize was Silesia, a fertile, rich province held by Austria. Europe gasped, then moved to arms. The boy who once wrote verses now wrote orders. But his strategy was not born of aggression. It was born of the mind. Frederick treated warfare like a chessboard, and the pieces were real men. He understood terrain as if it were poetry, reading hills and rivers like lines of meaning. His troops marched with unflinching discipline, trained to turn on a coin. In battle, he was both conductor and combatant, leading charges, issuing orders with clipped precision. Victory was swift. Silesia fell into Prussian hands. But Frederick was not content with mere conquest. He saw war as a tool, not a desire. Once he claimed Silesia, he wrote letters to Voltaire and other Enlightenment thinkers, justifying his actions not in the language of blood, but of necessity, security, reason. He had fought, yes, but with a philosopher's hand. Yet this duality unnerved the courts of Europe. To some, Frederick was a genius. To others, a dangerous enigma. He loved French culture but wrote in German. He quoted Plato but trained cannons. His palaces held both military barracks and libraries. His reign began with fire, and yet it was fire guided by intellect. And so the continent watched. For in this quiet Prussian king, they sensed something rare. A man who might bend the future with both sword and thought. The 7 Years' Crucible. Then came the Crucible. The 7 Years' War. A storm that encircled the world, touching continents and oceans, but centered on Frederick. It began in 1756, and it brought with it a coalition of enemies that should have crushed him. Austria, France, Russia, and more, all aligned to unseat this small, rising power led by a king with a flute. Prussia was outnumbered, vastly. Its lands were narrow, its resources stretched thin. The very borders of Frederick's world seemed to close in. Yet he did not crumble. Instead, he adapted. He moved like smoke through the gaps between giants. The battles were brutal. At Kolin, he tasted bitter defeat. At Rossbach and Leuthen, he returned the blow with brilliance. Again and again, Frederick used speed, maneuver, and misdirection to defeat larger armies. His marches were grueling, his troops loyal beyond reason. He rode into battle beside them, not from behind, but within the line of fire. At times, the strain nearly broke him. Letters from the period show a man at the edge. He wrote of despair, of exhaustion, of watching comrades die and supply lines vanish. But he kept fighting, not because he believed in glory, but because he had no choice. Then came the darkest hour. Russia invaded. Berlin was threatened. Frederick prepared to make a last stand. And then a miracle. The Empress of Russia died. Her successor, Peter III, admired Frederick. Overnight, Russia withdrew. The tide turned. By 1763, the war ended. Prussia still stood. Against all odds, Frederick had preserved his kingdom. Not enlarged it, not celebrated it, but saved it from annihilation. And in doing so, he had become something else. No longer just the philosopher king. He was now the survivor king. A man who had faced the abyss and taught it to blink. Enlightenment in steel. In the quiet after war, Frederick turned inward, not to rest, but to rebuild. His vision for Prussia was not carved from victory, but from thought. He believed the crown was not a birthright, but a duty. "I am the first servant of the state," he declared, a phrase that would echo for centuries. And serve he did. Frederick reformed the law, stripping away remnants of feudal cruelty. He established a legal code that prized reason over rank, clarity over chaos. Religious tolerance became policy. Catholics, Protestants, Jews alike were granted protection. He had no patience for dogma, only for logic. Education blossomed under his reign. He founded schools, encouraged science, and expanded access to learning. The fields of medicine, physics, and philosophy grew under the light he cast. And yet, his own life remained spare. He lived simply, ate little, worked constantly. But his rule was not without contradiction. Though he championed liberty in letters, he held fast to absolute power. Though he modernized Prussia, he did not democratize it. The peasants remained under burdens. The nobility remained strong. And though he read Voltaire, he also censored writers who questioned too much. Still, something profound had shifted. Frederick had proven that a king could think, that a ruler could wield both musket and manuscript. His palaces bore this duality. Sanssouci, his retreat, was a haven of music and philosophy, yet stood beside barracks lined with muskets. Voltaire once lived with him, though their friendship cooled. Frederick had hoped for a meeting of minds, but found that even among thinkers, ego clashed. Still, he kept the philosopher's bust in his study, a silent companion to his thoughts. In the end, Frederick outlived most of his enemies. He died in 1786, his kingdom stronger than he found it. He had turned Prussia from a cluster of provinces into a European power. But more than territory, he left behind a model flawed, luminous, and enduring. A philosopher king, a soldier poet, a servant of the state who ruled with steel and soul. And long after his flute fell silent, the melody of his paradox played on, soft, serious, unforgettable. Chapter 12, The Emperor of Revolutions. Born on a rugged island kissed by Mediterranean winds, Napoleon Bonaparte arrived not in the grand halls of power, but in the shadows of obscurity. Corsica, still reeling from its absorption into France, gave him the name of an outsider, neither fully French nor wholly Corsican anymore. His voice carried the rough edges of the island, and his posture, even as a boy, held the defiance of one born to prove the world wrong. In the military academies of France, he was not welcomed with open arms but eyed with suspicion. Yet in every room he entered, Napoleon watched, listened, and calculated. He was not tall, yet his presence towered. He was not rich, yet he spoke like one who would shape empires. He consumed books on Caesar and Alexander like nourishment for the soul. And when the revolution tore through France like a tidal wave, Napoleon did not cower. He rode the chaos. His moment came in the smoke of cannon fire during the siege of Toulon. With precision and daring, he organized artillery placements that shattered the enemy's defenses. The young officer, barely 24, turned the tide of battle with math, steel, and instinct. Paris took notice. Soon, Napoleon was no longer the island boy with the accent. He was a general of the Republic. But it was in 1795, during the uprising in Paris, when he truly etched his name into the bones of history. Called upon to defend the government against royalist insurgents, he answered with cannons down the streets of his own capital. A whiff of grape shot, he would later call it, delivered without hesitation. Blood ran through the cobblestones, but power remained in the hands of the revolutionary government. And in its hands was Napoleon. He rose not by family name or noble blood, but by force of mind and mastery of war. With every campaign, he revealed a new layer of genius. Italy became his canvas. With daring flanks and unexpected maneuvers, he defeated larger, more seasoned armies. The French soldiers followed him not because they were told, but because they believed. Soldiers, he would call them before battle. You are naked and hungry, but the riches of Italy are before you. And they marched. They always marched. The Republic becomes a throne. For all his victories abroad, it was the silence at home that beckoned him most. France, though free from monarchy, was still a nation unsteady on its feet. The Directory, a weak and corrupt five-man council, led without vision. Napoleon, fresh from his campaign in Egypt, returned with something far greater than treasure or territory: momentum. In 1799, under the cloak of a fragile democracy, he staged a coup. With soldiers at his side and the people behind him, he entered the chambers of power and swept the Directory aside like dust from the marble floor. No one could stop him. By the time the sun rose the next day, France had a new ruler, first consul, they called him. But titles were merely symbols. Power, real power, was now his. He did not crush the revolution's legacy. He cloaked himself in it. The tricolor flag still flew. The language of liberty still echoed. But behind the words, a new empire was taking root. In 1804, standing beneath the towering arches of Notre Dame Cathedral, Napoleon placed a golden crown upon his own head. The Pope was there, but only as witness. "I am the revolution," his action declared, "and I decide who rules." He was emperor now, not by divine right, but by the will of victory. He kept the robes of Caesar, but wore them with the swagger of a man who had made himself. To the people of France, he promised glory. To the rest of Europe, he offered only silence or war. A map rewritten in marches. From the dusty roads of Italy to the frozen rivers of Russia, Napoleon reshaped Europe not with treaties, but with boots and banners. His armies marched like thunder. His strategies, taught even today, combined speed, deception, and ruthless precision. One by one, the old empires of Europe bent the knee or broke in defiance. Austria fell. Prussia shattered. Spain bled under occupation. The map, once a patchwork of proud kingdoms and shifting alliances, became something else entirely, a reflection of his ambition. Brother Joseph ruled in Spain. Brother Louis ruled in Holland. He created kings as if casting statues from the furnace of war. At Austerlitz in 1805, the sun rose not just on a battlefield, but on a legend. Outnumbered and encircled, Napoleon turned apparent weakness into devastating trap. The French army split the enemy in two and crushed them. Even the mighty Russians and Austrians could not match his genius that day. The Battle of the Three Emperors, they would call it, but only one left triumphant. He rewrote laws, reformed education, and expanded the reach of the Napoleonic Code, a legal framework still alive in many countries today. He touched every corner of life with the same certainty he showed in war. And yet, beneath all this power, cracks had begun to form. His continental system, a blockade designed to choke British trade, strained the economies of allies and enemies alike. Nationalism simmered in the lands he had conquered. The victories piled higher, but the cost of each was heavier than the last. Still, he could not stop. He would not stop. Destiny, he believed, had chosen him. And so he marched east, toward the vastness of Russia, where glory waited behind the veil of winter. The fall after flame. Russia was not like the rest. It did not break. It burned. As Napoleon's Grand Army pushed toward Moscow, the Russians offered no decisive battle, only retreat and fire. The French marched deeper into nothing, and when they finally arrived in the capital, it was ablaze. Empty, ruined, and cold. Winter fell like a hammer. Supply lines vanished in the snow. Frostbite replaced gunfire as the enemy. Horses died. Men starved. The once mighty army of 500,000 returned as ghosts. Only a fraction survived the retreat. Europe smelled blood. The old enemies, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Britain, united. And this time, Napoleon was no longer the wind. He was the tree caught in it. Battle after battle wore him down. At Leipzig in 1813, he suffered his greatest defeat. Still, he clung to the crown. In 1814, Paris fell. He abdicated, sent to exile on the small island of Elba. It should have ended there, but the fire in his chest had not dimmed. Less than a year later, he escaped, returned, reclaimed power. For one last dance, the 100 Days, that was all he had left. He gathered loyal soldiers, marched once more, and faced the final chapter at Waterloo. It rained. Mud swallowed the battlefield. Missteps, hesitation, and fate conspired. The British, led by Wellington, held firm. The Prussians arrived. The Emperor of Revolutions, who had once crowned himself ruler of men, now watched his empire collapse into earth and ash. He surrendered, exiled again, this time to the windswept rock of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, far from the echoes of his triumphs. There, surrounded by sea and silence, he walked the cliffs and remembered the roar of crowds, the thrill of strategy, the weight of destiny. France, army, head of the army, Josephine, were said to be his final words. Fragments of a life lived too brightly to last. Yet even in his fall, the world could not forget him. Statues rose. Histories were rewritten. He remained not as a man, but as myth, the flame that consumed and created. The revolution had many fathers, but only one emperor. And in the quiet spaces of time, when empires are remembered and kings are weighed not by titles, but by echoes, the name Napoleon rises. Complex, burning, immortal. Chapter 13. The Scholar of the Southern Throne. Orphaned by politics, Pedro is crowned at 5, and shaped by tutors, not generals. The southern winds that curled across Rio de Janeiro in the year 1831 carried not only salt and sand from the Atlantic, but also the silent whispers of a nation in waiting. Inside the palace, behind its tall, somber doors, a boy sat in the echoes of grown-up footsteps, listening to a world too large for his small shoulders. Pedro de Alcántara João Carlos Leopoldo Salvador Bibiano Francisco Xavier de Paula Leocadio Miguel Gabriel Rafael Gonzaga, barely 5 years old, was not playing with toys but being dressed in ceremonial robes. His father, Emperor Pedro I of Brazil, had abdicated in haste, departing to reclaim his birthright in Portugal, leaving the Empire of Brazil in the hands of a child who understood little of crowns and much less of power. But fate did not raise Pedro II with the iron rod of military conquest. No general would sculpt him. No battlefield would teach him dominion. Instead, his childhood was a quiet one, if loneliness can ever be called quiet. Shaped in libraries and study halls, his companions not courtiers or warriors but books and maps, languages and letters. Tutors were his guardians. Scholars were his protectors. At an age when others chased butterflies in gardens, Pedro wandered through Latin, Greek, French, and the sciences with curious wonder. While revolutions cracked the bones of empires in Europe, Brazil's boy emperor sat cross-legged, tracing the stars in an astronomy journal, asking questions that shook his instructors into admiration. He did not grow into a man of frivolity. Even his play was purposeful, a blend of reason and reflection. From his earliest years, the weight of responsibility was not just a crown atop his head. It was a quiet presence in every page he turned. Brazil had chosen, through crisis and compromise, a monarch of intellect rather than force, and Pedro, as if molded by divine patience, would become the emperor who would read before he ruled, think before he acted, and learn before he judged. The halls of his youth were filled not with laughter, but the slow ticking of clocks, the rustling of paper, and the distant sounds of a country learning to find itself. In that silence, Brazil's destiny softened, not toward war or tyranny, but toward thought. And at the center of it all was the boy without a father, becoming the man of every mind. Enlightenment in the tropics. He promotes science, railways, literacy, building a Brazil of thought, not only trade. As Pedro II matured into his crown, the boy emperor transformed into a sovereign of serenity and sophistication. The tropical sun that once bathed his youth now lit the path of a monarch unlike any other, a ruler not driven by conquest or gold, but by the glimmering light of reason. While other empires demanded expansion through arms and ambition, Pedro expanded his empire through the corridors of thought, sowing seeds of enlightenment in the rich soil of Brazil's future. He became a friend of intellect, a correspondent of Darwin, a patron of Pasteur, and a lover of all that elevated the mind. Where others raised armies, he raised universities. Where others built fortresses, he laid the steel rails of railroads that stitched distant lands together. For Pedro, progress was not measured by the roar of cannons or the applause of parades, but by the steady hum of locomotives, the scribble of pens in classrooms, the quiet confidence of a literate people. He adored photography and supported the spread of telegraphs. He nurtured science and celebrated invention. In Pedro's Brazil, knowledge was not a foreign luxury, it was a native right. He stood at the crossroads of tradition and innovation, choosing not the blind embrace of either, but the balance between them. His empire pulsed with the promise of the modern, yet never abandoned its soul. His vision was not only political but poetic. He believed that a ruler must serve, not shine, that the brightest throne was one set at the feet of learning. The emperor often traveled in simple clothes, reading newspapers and engaging the public as a scholar among citizens. His beard became iconic not for majesty, but for its quiet dignity, a symbol of a king who ruled not from above, but beside. Even the trees seemed to lean in as he walked through the palace gardens with philosophers and poets, discussing history, astronomy, and the human heart. Brazil, long seen as a land of riches and resources, became, under Pedro, a land of ideas, stretching not only across land, but across thought. And while the world around him wavered in chaos and revolution, Pedro too remained a lighthouse of the mind, calm, clear, and steady in the storm. The shadow of slavery. Though cautious, Pedro pushes toward abolition and watches his empire shift beneath him. But even the brightest minds walk under shadows. And for Pedro too, the deepest shadow that darkened his enlightened reign was the persistence of slavery. Brazil, the last country in the Western world to cling to the cruel institution, bore a contradiction so sharp that even progress groaned beneath its weight. The emperor, a man of letters and justice, inherited a country whose wealth rested on the backs of the bound, and the chains that dragged through Brazil's sugar plantations echoed through the throne room. Pedro, cautious and deliberate, did not wield change with fire but with gentle persistence. He despised slavery in spirit. He had said as much in private and in personal letters. He freed the slaves he inherited, supported abolitionist efforts, and allowed his own daughter, Princess Isabel, to push forward more forcefully. Yet his approach was not that of a revolutionary. It was patient, slow, and some said too slow. But the ground was shifting, the winds were changing, and beneath Pedro's feet, the empire he had so carefully nurtured began to stir with unrest. Abolitionists cried louder. Plantation owners grumbled. The military, once loyal, became restless. And while Pedro stood for reason began to feel out of place in a nation growing tired of patience. The Golden Law, passed by his daughter in 1888, abolished slavery once and for all to international applause and internal friction. Pedro did not resist. He did not grasp at power. He did not rebuke the inevitable. But in the quiet of his heart, perhaps he knew that when the chains fell from the enslaved, something else was slipping too. The final thread of stability that had bound the empire together. Reform had come, but with it, revolution. Pedro had taught a nation to think, and now it thought beyond monarchy. Still, history remembers not the hesitation but the heart. Though he did not tear slavery down with thunder, he helped unravel it with grace. His empire may have trembled, but his conscience stood firm. And in the end, the scholar king walked that delicate edge between what was demanded and what was right, always with dignity, always with care. The gentle fall. Overthrown without bloodshed, he leaves with grace, and with a legacy that outlasts a crown. In the soft haze of 1889, the empire fell, not with riots or rifles, but with a whisper. A coup, bloodless and brief, unfolded like a quiet curtain drawn across the final act of a peaceful play. The monarchy dissolved. The republic was born. And Pedro too, the emperor who had read Shakespeare and written poems in his margins, accepted his dismissal with the calm of a man who had long seen it coming. There was no defiance in his departure, no speech from balconies, no desperate cries to stay, only silence and then a suitcase. When told of the change, he is said to have nodded gently and spoken only 4 words. If it is so, dethroned without disgrace, he walked out of the palace not as a fallen king, but as a man released from duty. He boarded a ship to Europe where he would live simply, quietly, in hotels and libraries, carrying with him no riches, only books and memories. In Paris, he would often stroll the streets unnoticed, stopping in museums, reading in cafes, reflecting on a life that had been given not to power, but to purpose. He missed Brazil dearly. He never ceased to love it. And when he died in 1891, his final words were whispered not to crowns or courts, but to the land he had served. May my last thought be for my country. He was buried with simplicity. No golden tomb, no loud eulogy. Only honor, only memory. Years later, Brazil welcomed his remains back with reverence, recognizing not the monarch, but the man. His legacy outlived his empire, a legacy of literacy, of thought, of gentle strength. Pedro too proved that greatness does not need spectacle, that kingship can be humble, and that intellect is a throne of its own. And so, beneath the southern sky, his story remains, not in battles, not in conquest, but in the quiet glow of a nation once guided by a scholar's steady hand. In the hush of bedtime, his memory drifts like ocean mist, wrapping Brazil's history in a lullaby of learning, light, and love. Chapter 14, The Lion of Judah. In the early morning mist of Ethiopia's highlands, the mountains stretch like ancient fingers toward the heavens, draped in veils of cloud. And there, standing between the sky and the stone, rose a man whose very name carried the echo of prophecy, Haile Selassie. Born as Tafari Makonnen in 1892, his rise was not sudden, but patient, carved by lineage and by the winds of destiny that seemed to whisper his name long before the world would know it. He was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia in 1930, taking the name Haile Selassie, meaning Power of the Trinity. His titles were not merely ceremonial. King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah. These were declarations that stretched back to the Queen of Sheba and Solomon, binding myth and monarchy in a single crown. Selassie did not rule in the shadows of myths alone. He stood at the crossroads of worlds, one foot planted in the sacred traditions of the Ethiopian Orthodox faith, and the other poised to meet a rapidly changing world. He was a scholar, a diplomat, a devout man who viewed leadership not as privilege but burden. His gaze extended beyond the valleys of Ethiopia and across the continents, knowing that his small, proud kingdom was surrounded by empires that had long since carved Africa apart. Yet, in that soft-eyed, sharp-minded king, there was resolve. He was the first African monarch to fully embrace the shifting tide of international diplomacy. He modernized Ethiopia's army and education, brought railways and industry, and walked a fine line between sacred sovereignty and necessary progress. But beneath every decision lay a deep reverence for his people, his faith, and the sacred weight of his bloodline. In portraits and memory, he always seemed slightly elevated, as if part of him still dwelled above the clouds, never untethered, but never quite grounded. He ruled not just from a throne, but from a vision, and that vision would soon be tested by fire. The invaders from the sky. The silence of Ethiopia's mountains was shattered in 1935, when the engines of Mussolini's Italy roared into the sky. The fascist regime sought not merely territory, but humiliation, an ancient vendetta against Ethiopia, the only African nation to have defeated a European army decades earlier at the Battle of Adwa. Now Italy returned, armed with aircraft, mustard gas, and a hunger for empire. Ethiopia was not prepared for such an onslaught. Its soldiers, brave and devout, fought with rifles and prayers against tanks and bombs. Haile Selassie, watching his people bleed and the churches burn, made a decision both bitter and wise. He would leave, not to escape but to speak, to flee not from the fight, but toward a world that watched and remained silent. In 1936, he stood before the League of Nations in Geneva, a small man in a black robe, with sorrow in his eyes and thunder in his voice. His speech was one of the most haunting in modern history. He did not plead, but prophesied. "It is us today. It will be you tomorrow," he warned. A line that would echo through the years as war would eventually reach even the most powerful nations in Europe. The emperor, whose homeland burned, whose throne was taken, did not raise his voice in rage. He let silence surround each word, like fog in the valley, and the world leaned in to hear. Yet the League of Nations, meant to be the guardian of peace, responded with shrugs and weak sanctions. The emperor returned not to Ethiopia, but into exile, walking through foreign lands like a lion without a den. But in that wandering, something deeper stirred. He became more than a monarch. He became a symbol of resistance, of black dignity, of prophecy. The Lion of Judah did not sleep. He waited. Return of the exiled. When the fires of World War II swept across the globe, alliances shifted like sand, and the tides of empire began to churn against themselves. Italy, once confident in its conquest, now faltered. Britain turned its gaze toward Africa, and in 1941, Haile Selassie, once exiled, once doubted, returned. But he did not return alone. He came with Ethiopian patriots, British forces, and a weighty calm that had grown in exile. His re-entry into Addis Ababa was not triumphant in the traditional sense. It was sacred. The streets, once broken by tanks, were now filled with tears and songs. Children who had only known war saw their emperor again. Women wept into their hands. Priests chanted. It was as if the spirit of the nation had walked back into its body. But Haile Selassie was not the same man who had left. The years abroad had changed him. He had seen the gears of global power up close, witnessed how quickly peace turned to dust. Now, back on his throne, he ruled with a tempered vision, still majestic but cautious. He rebuilt Ethiopia with care. He strengthened schools, hospitals, roads, and governance. Yet his heart, always pulled between the divine and the political, often beat in rhythms that the modern world found difficult to follow. He would later confront new storms, famines, rebellions, calls for democracy. Yet through it all, he remained serene, nearly unreadable. Even as time caught up, even as the young grew restless, even as whispers turned to unrest, Haile Selassie did not flinch. He had ruled through clouds, through fire, through exile and return. He knew that every king must someday face the fading of power, but he also knew that legacy is not made in palaces. It is made in memory, a legacy across oceans. Far from the Ethiopian highlands, across the wide blue oceans, a different kind of flame began to glow, not in the temples of state, but in the hearts of a people searching for light. In the Caribbean island of Jamaica, where centuries of colonialism had left scars and silence, a new faith emerged. It looked toward Africa, not as myth but as home. And at its center was Haile Selassie. To the Rastafarian movement, he was not merely a king. He was the king, the living embodiment of divine royalty, the promised redeemer, the Lion of Judah in flesh. They called him Jah Rastafari. His coronation, his bloodline, his stance against colonialism, all were seen not just as history, but as revelation. Songs were sung in his name, dreadlocks grown in his honor, and prayers offered not to distant gods, but to a living emperor. Haile Selassie, though never proclaiming himself divine, received their reverence with grace. When he visited Jamaica in 1966, the island trembled with emotion. Thousands lined the tarmac. Women fainted. Men wept. The air smelled of incense and expectation. And as his plane touched down, even the rain paused. He stepped into that moment not as a ruler above, but as a bridge between worlds, between Africa and its diaspora, between the past and a hopeful future. His image, regal, wise, watchful, became etched not only in books, but in music, murals, and the dreams of the oppressed. In Africa, he helped birth the Organization of African Unity, advocating for the liberation of colonized nations. His words became blueprints, his presence reassurance. But as the years turned, and his power shifted in Ethiopia once more, Selassie's earthly reign came to a quiet, painful end in 1975. Overthrown in a coup, he disappeared behind palace walls. No grand funeral, no procession, just whispers and then silence. And yet he was not gone. In the eyes of Rastafarians, he had ascended. In the memory of Ethiopia, he remained the emperor who had spoken to the world. And in the chronicles of history, he stood tall between myth and reality, between past and future. Haile Selassie did not rule through might alone. He ruled through presence, through prophecy, through patience. The Lion of Judah may have vanished from the throne, but his roar still echoes, in the highlands, in the islands, in the hearts of all who look toward the horizon and dream of dignity, of justice, of kingship not carved by conquest, but by conviction. As night falls over the hills of Africa, and the stars begin to shimmer above Addis Ababa, one can almost hear his footsteps in the quiet, steady, regal, unhurried. A crown once lifted by clouds, still gleaming softly in the mind of history. Chapter 15, The Ice King of the North. In the pale quiet of a northern dawn, the world felt suspended between two breaths. The chill of Sweden's forests, blanketed with frost, whispered ancient hymns through the tall pines. In a castle rising from the quiet snows of Stockholm, A boy looked out beyond the ice-slicked windows, not with wonder, but with weight in his eyes. Gustavus Adolphus was only 16 when the crown of Sweden settled upon his golden curls, too young by law, too solemn by soul, and yet already molded by fire. The year was 1611. He inherited not a throne carved in peace, but one besieged by chaos. Denmark loomed to the south like a coiled serpent, claws sunk into disputed borderlands. Poland, once family by blood, had become an enemy by ambition. And Russia, wounded and wild, watched with hungry eyes. Sweden, small and exposed, was caught in the northern storm. His father's wars had hollowed the kingdom's purse and burdened its people. Gustavus did not weep at his coronation, but the sky above him was iron gray, and the silence in the court was as heavy as snow before the avalanche. They called him a boy, but even then, he knew the soul of a king is not measured in years. He rode with soldiers before he was 10. He studied not just languages and scripture, but maps, cannons, and maneuver. His mother, Christina, a woman of cold iron will, did not cradle him in softness. She taught him to wear grief like armor and duty like flame. The boy learned early that leadership was loneliness, a cathedral echoing with voices, yet rarely with understanding. As he took up the crown, Gustavus did not wait for peace to arrive. He rode into war almost immediately, his breath visible in the cold air as he led his men across frozen rivers. This was no ceremonial king. He was forged in the same steel his knights carried. While others saw a young ruler as vulnerable, Gustavus knew that youth could bring daring, and daring, when guided by reason, could remake the world. The art of war transformed. The battlefield had long been a place of brute power, lumbering pikes, slow volleys, and muddy charges. But Gustavus saw more than blood and noise. To him, war was a language, and he would become its poet. The armies of the day were heavy and unwieldy, tied to old feudal ways and rigid commands. Gustavus stripped it all down like a sculptor removing marble to find the shape beneath. He began by making his army faster. No longer would regiments crawl across terrain like wounded beasts. He broke infantry into smaller, flexible units. He armed them with lighter muskets and drilled them with terrifying precision. His men could fire in synchronized volleys, reload rapidly, and shift formations on command, dancing through the chaos like shadows through fog. He brought in mobile artillery, light enough to be pulled by a single horse, nimble enough to reposition mid-battle. Cannons no longer thundered from afar in fixed places. They moved with the army, like fangs shifting in a predator's mouth. Cavalry was no longer reckless charge, but tightly coordinated shock units, weaving in and out of enemy lines with deadly timing. And beyond tactics, he changed the soul of the soldier. Gustavus was not a distant king watching from a palace. He fought at the front, spoke to his men as brothers, shared their meals, their chills, their prayers. He educated his officers in ethics as well as war. Discipline was strict, but purpose was sacred. His army became not just a tool of conquest, but a model of national unity, a breathing extension of Sweden itself. By the time his enemies recognized what he had created, it was already too late. The Lion of the North had redefined what war could be. His reforms would echo across Europe for centuries, reshaping the very core of how battles were fought. And in each victory, in each new strategy etched into snow or smoke, Gustavus was not merely fighting for land. He was proving that brilliance, when fused with courage, could bend history itself. Faith and fire in Germany. Europe in the 17th century was a continent smoldering on the edge of spiritual collapse. The 30 Years' War had begun not just as a political struggle, but as a collision of belief, Catholic against Protestant, empire against independence, tradition against Reformation. The Holy Roman Empire, under Habsburg command, had become a crushing tide threatening to drown the Protestant states of Northern Europe. Into this crucible of faith and fury, Gustavus stepped, not as a neutral monarch, but as a man convinced that heaven itself was watching. He saw the German lands as a sacred trust, not merely a battleground but a theater of salvation. When he crossed into Germany in 1630, leading his blue-clad Swedish troops onto foreign soil, It was not invasion, it was deliverance. The Lutheran princes of the north had prayed for aid. Their cities had burned, their people scattered. Gustavus brought not just swords, but hope. And behind him, a disciplined army. Crisp formations in the cold morning light, their banners emblazoned with crosses and crowns. He moved like a storm through the empire. Cities fell not to looting, but to reform. He banned the brutal pillaging common in warfare, ordered mercy on civilians, and held his officers accountable to divine law as well as royal command. To the desperate, he was a holy fire, fierce, consuming but cleansing. Yet not all welcomed him. Some Protestant leaders feared his strength, just as Catholic kings loathed his defiance. But Gustavus had no interest in compromise. To him, neutrality in the face of tyranny was betrayal. His victories at Breitenfeld and Rhein shattered imperial confidence. Protestant morale soared. Still, he never grew arrogant. Before each campaign, he prayed alone. He wrote letters to his wife filled with longing and fear. He knew the sword could only carry righteousness so far. The heart behind it mattered more. Gustavus did not conquer for glory. He advanced for God, and for the fragile dream that Europe might still belong to both faith and freedom. The fall at Lutzen. The air over Saxony was thick with mist. It was late autumn, 1632. Frost crept along the edges of blades and boots. The fields near Lutzen were silent at dawn, save for the soft murmurs of troops waiting, shifting in the cold. Gustavus Adolphus stood among them, his presence as steady as stone. He had come too far to turn back now. The empire's forces were massed ahead, led by the famed General Wallenstein. Cunning, relentless, and prepared. The fog clung to the earth like a veil of ghosts. When the battle began, it unfolded in fragments. Muskets fired into white oblivion. Cavalry emerged and vanished like phantoms. No one could see the full field. Orders were shouted, lost, improvised. And in the heart of it all rode the king, not watching from afar, but charging ahead, sword drawn, cloak flying like a shadow behind him. Then, in the chaos, he vanished. For a time, none could find him. Then came the whisper through the ranks, passed from trembling lips to stunned ears. The king is down. He had been shot. Once in the arm, again in the back, then finally in the chest. His body, stripped by enemy hands, was left lifeless in the mud. His face turned toward heaven. He was 37 years old. Yet the battle did not break. His army, enraged and grieving, surged forward with renewed fury. They drove the imperial forces back and claimed the field. Lutzen was a Swedish victory, but one painted in grief. His death was not the end, but a beginning. In that moment, Gustavus became more than man. He became myth. Sweden rose to its greatest power in the years that followed, his reforms guiding generations. And across Europe, Protestant states remembered his name not merely as a king, but as a shield, a light in dark times. Gustavus Adolphus, the Ice King of the North, had brought warmth to a frozen world. Through strategy, conviction, and sacrifice, he had reshaped a continent and redefined the meaning of righteous power. His footsteps faded into history, but the path he carved through snow and smoke remains, eternal and echoing. Chapter 16. The Mirror and the Mask. Born into the ashes of a splintered land, Tokugawa Ieyasu came into the world in 1543, not as a prince on a throne, but as a child entangled in the cold wires of war. Japan was a nation broken into warring clans, each one clawing for control, and little Ieyasu, then called Matsudaira Teichio, was just another piece in their game. At the tender age of 6, he was sent as a hostage to the Imagawa clan, not as punishment, but as strategy. His father, lord of a modest domain, hoped loyalty could be proven not with treaties, but with the blood bond of a child surrendered. In that moment, Ieyasu's childhood ended, and a new kind of learning began. He lived among those who did not love him but needed him. In those early years of captivity, he became fluent not just in letters or swordplay, but in silence, in watching, in waiting. A boy raised in another man's court learned the ways of grown men, how they smiled while scheming, how they bowed while calculating betrayal. The halls of power were quiet, cold, and filled with veiled threats. But Ieyasu listened. He observed. He remembered. And unlike so many who were destroyed by the game of alliances and betrayals, he learned how to survive it. Years passed, and the hostage became a warrior. With the fall of his captors and the chaos of Japan still unending, Ieyasu returned to reclaim his name. He was no longer the boy sacrificed to politics. He had become a man sharpened by them. He allied with Oda Nobunaga, the rising flame who sought to unify Japan, and later with Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the cunning strategist who built on that ambition. But always, Ieyasu held back. Never first, never loud, never reckless. He did not rush to take the throne. He waited, as he always had, watching the storm tear others apart. And then, when the sky cleared, he stepped forward with a quietness that would change everything. After the ashes of Sekigahara, the year was 1600, the Battle of Sekigahara, a single clash, fierce and short, decided the fate of an entire nation. For decades, Japan had known nothing but the taste of war. Fractured clans, endless sieges, blood spilled for castles that would crumble in the next campaign. Ieyasu, then a seasoned lord and master of patience, gathered his forces not with rage, but with calculation. His army was large, yes, but more importantly, it was unified by promises he made and debts he was owed. As the sun rose over the misty fields of Sekigahara, thousands marched under banners. Some for Ieyasu, some against, but all of them into history. The battle was brutal. It lasted only a day, but its ripples would echo for centuries. Ieyasu's victory was not merely military, it was psychological. He had positioned himself as the heir to peace, the man who would end the Age of Swords. Yet he did not crown himself emperor, nor did he wear his victory loudly. Instead, he took the title of shogun, supreme military commander. A role rooted in warrior culture, yes, but under his rule it would become something far more complex. The genius of Ieyasu's governance was not in the way he won power, but in the way he kept it. His reforms did not announce themselves with trumpets. They slipped into place like quiet locks on invisible doors. He created a system where loyalty was rewarded, rebellion suffocated not by force, but by bureaucracy and economics. Daimyo, powerful lords, were ordered to maintain two residences, one in their own domain and one in Edo, the new capital. Their wives and children were required to live in Edo permanently, a gentle form of hostage-taking that mirrored Ieyasu's own youth. No blades drawn, just families separated and bound. In every corner of governance, he built checks and balances. Rice, the heart of Japan's economy, was measured, taxed, distributed, and controlled. No one starved, but no one grew too rich either. Highways were built not just to connect cities, but to surveil movement. Temples and shrines were respected, but never allowed to rise too high. And samurai? Once the fearsome knights of Japan, they now spent more time managing records than wielding swords. Peace had come, not with a cheer, but a breath. The shogun's mirror. In the years that followed, Tokugawa Ieyasu ruled not with spectacle, but with presence. He was often unseen, yet always felt, like a mirror held up to every man of power in Japan. Behind the rituals of court and ceremony, he placed structure. Behind the armor of tradition, he hid the gears of control. His government was a web, and every strand led back to Edo, to the shogun, to the still face behind the mask. He rarely raised his voice. He rarely punished in public. But when he did, it was decisive. A rebellious clan would find itself disarmed not by soldiers, but by paperwork. A treasonous whisper might disappear beneath layers of silence. The speaker reassigned, their lands redistributed. Ieyasu understood something vital. Fear did not have to roar. Sometimes it only had to hum beneath the surface, constant and low. Even the emperor, the divine figurehead of Japan, was kept in Kyoto, distant, ceremonial. Ieyasu bowed, gave gifts, and paid respects, but the real power was his. The illusion of continuity was preserved, and with it, stability. To the people, it felt like nothing had changed. To those in power, it was clear that everything had. He surrounded himself with scholars, advisors, and monks. He encouraged learning, but not rebellion. The arts flourished, but within the boundaries he set. Poetry, painting, tea ceremonies, no theater. All were given space to bloom, yet all served the deeper structure of peace. The sword, once the symbol of authority, now hung in museums and over hearths. Its presence was nostalgic, not necessary. Ieyasu had turned the weapons of war into symbols of the past, and he let them gather dust. In his later years, he retired in name but not in spirit. His son took the title of shogun, but Ieyasu continued to guide from behind the curtain. When he finally passed away in 1616, he did so having seen his vision take root. He left not just a kingdom, but a system, one that would outlive him by more than 2 centuries. The Tokugawa shogunate, forged in silence and steel, would become one of the longest peaceful regimes in human history. Edo, a city of still waters. And in the heart of that silence rose Edo, not the roaring battlefield or the mountain fortress, but a city of balance and breath. Where once samurai had galloped into combat, now they walked the stone streets, writing poetry and teaching calligraphy. Merchants built wealth within limits, their wooden shops lining canals and bridges. Families thrived in orderly neighborhoods. The city pulsed gently, never too loud, never too still. Edo was more than a capital. It was a reflection of Ieyasu's mind. Clean, structured, purposeful. It rose from a fishing village into the most populous city in the world by the 18th century, not because of conquest, but because of the quiet rhythm of order. The seasons passed, not marked by battles, but by festivals and harvests. Sakura blossoms fell over shrines where monks chanted the same sutras year after year. Children learned the same poems, studied the same codes of conduct, and bowed at the same gates. Samurai who had once lived by the sword now lived by the pen. Their code, Bushido, did not die. It was transformed. Loyalty, restraint, honor, and self-control became not the cries of the battlefield, but the values of daily life. The warrior spirit was not crushed. It was refined, tempered like a blade left in water instead of flame. This was the gift Ieyasu left behind. A peace so deep it settled into the bones of a generation. The echoes of war faded into dreams, and for once, Japan was not divided by ambition, but united by stillness. The mirror he held to his nation reflected not chaos, but clarity. And the mask he wore, stern, unreadable, became the face of peace itself. As the centuries turned and new powers rose around the world, Japan remained steady in its rhythm. Edo's waters, though calm, were never stagnant. They flowed quietly, shaped not by wind, but by will. And in every silent rule, in every unseen hand, there was the lingering presence of the man who had once been a hostage, and who became the master of an age. When night falls upon the memory of Tokugawa Ieyasu, it falls softly, not with the clang of armor, but with the hush of footsteps on tatami mats. His legacy lies not in what he conquered, but in what he preserved. A fragile peace, held firm by invisible threads, woven by the quiet strength of a man who understood that sometimes the greatest power is the power not to act until the world is ready to listen. And so, under the quiet sky of a long-ago Edo, the mirror and the mask remain, silent symbols of a king who chose not to shine, but to endure. Chapter 17, The Peacock and the Power. He was only 17 when the weight of Persia settled on his shoulders. Too young, said the whispers in shadowed halls. Too bold, murmured the elders behind silk screens. Shah Abbas, heir to a fractured throne, walked among serpents. His kingdom, once a roaring lion stretching from the Tigris to the Indus, now whimpered beneath betrayal, siege, and the slow poison of internal decay. Enemies encircled him like wolves testing the edge of a campfire's light. The Ottomans pressing in from the west, the Uzbeks clawing from the northeast, and within his court, the air grew thick with plots. Abbas was born into a kingdom ruled by ghosts, the echoes of his Safavid ancestors, glorious and gone. As a boy, he was more prisoner than prince. His own father, Shah Muhammad Kodabanda, ruled weakly, blind both in sight and in vision, propped up by cruel courtiers. Abbas was hidden away in Herat, not for safety, but as leverage, a prince kept like a coin in the pocket of rival warlords. But even in chains, the young lion studied the world. He watched how men spoke with honeyed words and daggered intentions. He learned how alliances bent with the wind and how loyalty, in palaces of silk, was often the rarest gem. And when the moment came, when the country shivered with unrest and the throne looked for a firmer spine, Abbas struck. Aided by the cunning vizier Murshid Tsuli Khan, he seized power in a move swift and ruthless, toppling the rot that festered behind the veil of royal pretense. He did not inherit a kingdom. He clawed it from the jaws of chaos. His eyes, calm and calculating, did not blink when old allies were cast aside. In a court of whispers, Abbas learned to speak only in results. The boy who had once been caged became the man who commanded storms. The sword of Persia. But a throne reclaimed is not a throne secured. Persia, under Abbas's early rule, was a mosaic of fear and fracture. His enemies were not content to watch a child grow into a sovereign. They tested him, poked at his borders, stole his cities. The Ottomans, vast and cruel in ambition, had taken Tabriz and more. The Uzbeks still prowled the eastern plains, plundering and mocking. Abbas knew he could not face them yet. Not as he was. So he waited, and in the waiting he forged steel. He did not rush to battle. He rebuilt. The old Kizilbash warriors, proud and unpredictable, had grown too powerful, tribal warlords in all but name. So Abbas, in quiet defiance of tradition, created a new military from the ground up. He took enslaved boys, Christian Georgians, Armenians, and Circassians, and trained them in loyalty, discipline, and firepower. These gulams, servants only to the Shah, became the heart of a modern Persian army. With muskets in hand and silence in step, they were unlike anything Persia had seen. He did not just strengthen the sword, he sharpened the mind behind it. Abbas moved the capital to Isfahan not just for beauty, but for control. There, he could watch the pulse of the empire, keep courtiers close, and enemies closer still. He forged alliances with European powers, opening trade and diplomacy. And when the time came, when the blade was ready, he struck with terrible precision. Tabriz was retaken. The Ottomans, caught off guard by the rejuvenated army of Persia, fell back. In the east, the Uzbeks met their end. What had once been lost was now reclaimed in fire and fury. No longer a boy, Abbas rode at the front of his armies, not as a distant ruler, but as a commander cloaked in dust and valor. The desert winds carried the sound of his name like a rising storm. The empire, once trembling, now stood taller than its neighbors, wrapped in a banner of discipline and vision, the jewel of the world. But it was not enough for Abbas to be feared. He wished, too, to be remembered, not merely as a sword, but as a painter's dream. And so he turned to Isfahan, a city old in bones, but young in Abbas's dreams. He did not want walls that only protected. He wanted domes that whispered to the sky. Under his vision, Isfahan bloomed like a garden from divine imagination. The great square, Nakshi Jahan, image of the world, was carved into the heart of the city, a place where traders, scholars, and children alike walked beneath sunlit archways. The Shah Mosque, with its endless blue tiles, shimmered like the sky had come to rest upon its walls. Patterns of sacred geometry curled across domes and minarets. Not just decoration, but devotion. Bridges arched over rivers like poems in stone, connecting districts not only in space, but in spirit. Abbas built schools and caravanserais, opened roads for travelers and thoughts for thinkers. He invited poets from distant lands. Painters, calligraphers, architects, they came not only to be paid, but to participate in something grand. Abbas's court became a beacon of the arts, where ink flowed like wine and stories bloomed like spring trees. Even the smallest detail, the curve of a stairway or the shape of a window, held meaning. Abbas did not merely construct, he composed. His city was not a place, it was an idea, a mirror held up to the heavens. And the people came, merchants from Venice, travelers from India, scholars from the Ottoman lands. All found themselves in a city that felt like a dream made solid. They called it Isfahan Nesfi Jahan. Isfahan is half the world. And under Abbas's gaze, it truly was. The price of perfection. But no flame burns without casting shadows. And in the shadows of perfection, fear sometimes grows tallest. As Abbas grew older, his victories turned to echoes. He had built an empire strong, but empires are not stone. They are breath and blood, and both are fragile. The very systems he had created, the centralized state, the Ghulam army, the brilliant court, needed his hand always upon them. Power flowed outward from him, but little flowed back. He began to fear betrayal, not from enemies beyond, but from those within. He had no equal, and that, perhaps, was the loneliest truth of all. His sons, whom he had once raised in golden cages, became suspects. Paranoia, that quiet poison, whispered louder with each passing year. Abbas, who had survived betrayal as a youth, began to see it everywhere. He blinded one son, executed another. The heirs of Persia became ghosts behind palace walls. He trusted only those who could not threaten him. In protecting his legacy, he began to wound it. And yet, the streets of Isfahan remained radiant. The bridges still spanned rivers like dreams. Travelers still wrote of gardens that smelled of rose and saffron. Abbas never lost his vision, only the warmth that once framed it. By the time he died, the empire stood at its height, feared, admired, and revered. But within the royal halls, silence lingered where voices once laughed. The brilliance of the city could not hide the cost of control. History would remember him as Abbas the Great, and rightly so. Few kings shaped their world so completely. Few left behind such beauty, such discipline, such echoing pride. But power, like a peacock's feather, is both wonder and warning. Its beauty draws eyes, but its weight can break the bird that wears it. In the end, Abbas gave his people a garden to walk in, and bore the thorns in silence. A king of geometry and grief, of strategy and solitude, a ruler who made Persia glow again, and paid for every glimmer with a piece of himself. And so the story of Shah Abbas closes like the gates of a courtyard at dusk, golden with memory, heavy with meaning, and echoing softly through the corridors of time. Chapter 18, The Shadow Beyond Thrones. Across the long corridors of history, footsteps remain. They echo not with the thunder of armies nor the shouts of victory, but with something gentler, the weight of memory. From the sands of Persia to the snow-touched palaces of Russia, from the golden courts of France to the sunlit walls of Mali, kings have come and gone like seasons. And yet, their shadows stretch beyond time. Not all were just, not all were kind, but those who carved their names into the spirit of nations, they remain not in power, but in presence. There was Cyrus of Persia, the man who conquered with vision and governed with restraint. His empire, vast and shimmering like a constellation drawn on earth, was not merely ruled, it was cared for. He freed captives. He listened to prayers not his own. He built not only walls and roads, but respect between peoples. His crown was a symbol, yes, but also a burden he carried with clarity. Then came men like Charlemagne, whose reach stretched from Germanic forests to the halls of Rome. He reawakened an idea long asleep, that a king could also be a father of learning, a shepherd of civilization. His court sparkled with scholars and sacred texts. His wars were many, but so too were his dreams. In the far lands of the Sahara, there stood Mansa Musa, a king whose journey across the world shimmered with gold and generosity. He built mosques not for glory, but for God. He handed out wealth not for praise, but for purpose. And in China, there was Kangxi, whose reign was long, calm, and wise, a ruler who walked his lands and listened with the ear of a poet and the discipline of a sage. Each of these kings, though centuries apart and oceans between, wore their crowns with differing weight. Yet in their wake something lingered, not merely laws, not only monuments, but an imprint of what greatness could look like, not just when seen from a throne, but from the hearts of those who remembered them. They remind us, kings are not only those who held swords, but those who carried silence, patience, and care through halls of noise. Their crowns still echo, not in stone, but in story. The weight of a name. To be king is to wear more than a crown. It is to wear a name, one that may stretch like iron or crumble like ash beneath the pressure of the world. Power does not leave hands unscarred. It shapes men, sometimes like wind over sand, and sometimes like fire through forest. Alexander the Great conquered half the known world before he was 30. His name became legend, his ambition unmatched. But in his final days, alone and fevered, one wonders, did the world feel worth it? Was the vastness he created wide enough to fill the quiet within him? King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, lit his court in gold and made Versailles a palace of dreams. But to shine like the sun is to burn. He ruled longer than any European monarch, yet left a kingdom strained by war and pride. His name glowed in marble but flickered in the hearts of his people. And there was Ashoka, king of the Maurya Empire, who after war's horror, set down his sword and turned to Dharma. His name once brought fear, later peace. He became not just a ruler but a student of conscience, changing what his name would mean in the centuries that followed. A name, once spoken with awe, may fade into whispers. Others, soft in their time, may rise into reverence. What remains is how those names were carried, whether by force or grace, or the quiet strength of choosing the harder path. To be king is to face not just the weight of gold upon the head, but the invisible burden of every decision, every cry, every silent look from a hungry child or a hopeful soldier. It is to live inside history, while knowing history may not always be kind. And yet, many stepped forward. Some stumbled, others soared. Their names, like stars, still shine, but each bears its own gravity. Kings without scepters. Not all kings wore crowns. Not all ruled from thrones. Some walked among gardens. Others hid behind ink and parchment. There were those whose reigns were not over lands, but over ideas, whose empires lay in the hearts of men. Solomon, son of David, asked not for gold or vengeance, but wisdom, and it was granted to him in such measure that his judgments became legend. He ruled not with a sword, but with questions, and his answers, etched into time, guided kings long after his own had turned to dust. Then there was Frederick the Great of Prussia, a man both soldier and philosopher. He read Voltaire and wrote music, all while commanding armies. His greatness was not in conquest alone, but in thought, in choosing to rule with mind as much as might. And in the East, there was Sejong of Korea, who gave his people a new script, Hangul, so they could read, speak, and write their own thoughts freely. A king not of domination, but of liberation. His reign was a quiet miracle. These were kings who saw beyond the visible, who understood that leadership is not always loud, that it can arrive on silent feet, bearing books instead of banners, truths instead of taxes. Even in modern days, there have been those who ruled not as monarchs, but as moral kings. Men like Nelson Mandela, who after decades behind bars, emerged not with revenge, but with forgiveness. He was not called king, but in spirit he bore the dignity, the gravity, and the grace of one. Greatness is not always dressed in robes. Sometimes it kneels, sometimes it teaches, sometimes it simply listens. And in that quiet, it leaves behind a legacy that no kingdom can match. What remains? Time does not keep castles. It does not guard gold. The marble cracks, the banners fall, and even the loudest trumpet of power is eventually swallowed by the soft hush of years. But something lingers, like fragrance after rain, or music after silence. The stories, they are told in different tongues, whispered beside hearths, written in pages worn by fingertips and time, passed on not because of fear but because of wonder. What remains of kings is not their armies, but their echoes, not their laws but their light or the lack of it. Some kings left ruins, others left wisdom, some left questions that still haunt, others left hope. We remember not because they ruled, but because they revealed something about strength, about sorrow, about the choices that live inside power. In a child's history book, or in a grandmother's memory, their names flicker once more. Not loudly, not with thunder, but with a kind of hush that invites reflection. And perhaps that is the truest legacy. Not empire, but influence. Not territory, but tenderness. To have ruled, and to still be remembered, not for what one took, but for what one gave. As this journey ends, from Persia to Prussia, Mali to Mongolia, we do not carry swords or crowns. We carry stories. We carry meanings. And in the end, perhaps that is what greatness truly is. Not the shadow we cast upon the world, but the warmth we leave behind.